Hello, story seekers. Welcome to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep. And I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. It was a typical weekend getaway, or at least that's what I had thought. The air was crisp, the kind of chilly that made you feel alive, and the small town I found myself in seemed like the perfect retreat from the stresses of my usual routine. I was with two close friends. One of them was the quiet type, always lost in thought, while the other was the life of the party, always bringing energy to every situation. We had been planning this trip for months, just to get away from work and the daily grind. No distractions, no deadlines. Just a cozy little hotel and a peaceful weekend in the country. We arrived at the hotel late in the afternoon, the kind of late where the golden light of sunset was slipping away, leaving a pinkish way in the sky. The place itself looked like something out of an old storybook, a grand building with ivy creeping up its walls, surrounded by large oak trees. The sign hanging over the entrance swayed slightly in the breeze. The hotel wasn't modern by any means, but it had a charm to it that made you think of simpler times when people weren't glued to their screens and life felt slower, more connected. The lobby was dimly lit, with thick velvet curtains blocking the outside light. The check-in process was quick. The manager, an older man with graying hair, greeted us with a faint smile that never quite reached his eyes. He handed over the room keys, a heavy brass set, and instructed us to head up the winding staircase to the third floor. The building had that musty old book smell that you couldn't ignore, but it wasn't unpleasant. Just a bit nostalgic, like the scent of old memories locked in time. We made our way up, chatting about nothing in particular, taking in the creaky floorboards beneath our feet. The room we were given was a corner suite, and as we entered, I couldn't help but feel an odd sense of heaviness, as if the air was thicker than normal. The windows were covered with thick drapes, and there was a large four-poster bed in the center of the room. Everything seemed just a bit too quiet. No sounds of traffic or chatter from the streets below. It was as though the world outside had completely vanished. I set my bag down on one of the chairs by the window, my fingers brushing against the soft fabric of the curtains as I pulled them back, expecting to see a beautiful view of the countryside. Instead, all I saw was a dense fog that had rolled in unexpectedly. The trees outside were barely visible, and the distant hills were shrouded in mist. The air felt cooler, even through the glass. It wasn't exactly the picturesque landscape I had hoped for, but it was mysterious in its own way. And in that moment, I felt as though the hotel itself was drawing us in, inviting us to settle in for the night and forget about everything we had left behind. There was nothing particularly unusual about the room, just a little too much opulence in the old-fashioned furniture. The brass lamps were polished, but I noticed the floor beneath the bed seemed slightly uneven, as if the ground had shifted over the years. It was strange, but nothing to worry about. We unpacked our things, settled in, and began making plans for the evening. Dinner, maybe a stroll around the nearby town if it wasn't too late. We'd seen enough of the hotel's interior to be content staying in for the night. As we lounged around, cracking open a couple of snacks, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about the place. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, but the air felt different. Heavy, like it was filled with secrets. It wasn't uncomfortable, just strange. But I brushed it off, telling myself that it was probably just the change in surroundings. You know how it is when you step into a new environment, there's always that initial adjustment period, especially in a place so old and full of character. We were all in good spirits, laughing at some inside joke, completely oblivious to the subtle hints the building was trying to give us. The door to the room creaked behind me as I went to grab my coat from the chair. I turned around, expecting one of my friends to be standing there, but no one was. The door hadn't fully closed. It was slightly ajar, just enough for the cool air from the hall to creep in. I pushed it shut again without a second thought, too preoccupied with the moment to pay it much attention. The day continued in that peaceful, uneventful way. Dinner was quiet but satisfying, and afterward, we decided to turn in early. After all, we had nothing pressing to do the next day, and the fog outside made everything feel more conducive to rest. But as we lay in our beds, the tranquility of the hotel began to settle into something darker. In the silence of the room, with only the faint hum of the building around us, I couldn't help but feel that the walls were closing in, and not in the comforting way you might imagine. It felt like something was watching, something waiting. But when I looked around, all I saw were my two friends, already drifting off to sleep. So, I tried to push the feeling away, telling myself it was just a long day and my mind playing tricks on me. Little did I know, that's when everything would begin to shift slowly at first. And by the time I realized what was happening, it would already be too late to turn back. The night passed uneventfully at first, the kind of peaceful night you'd expect from a remote hotel in the countryside. I had drifted into a deep sleep, lulled by the comforting quiet of the room, only to be awoken by something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't the usual sounds, no distant traffic or voices in the hallways. It was a soft tapping sound, just loud enough to make me stir from my sleep. I laid there, eyes wide open in the darkness, trying to figure out if I had imagined it. The air in the room felt colder now, colder than it had before. The clock on the nightstand ticked away, and the faint glow from the streetlights outside cast long shadows across the walls. I glanced at the other beds, seeing my two friends still deep in sleep, their bodies silhouetted beneath the blankets. The tapping sound continued, a rhythmic series of small knocks, slow, deliberate. It wasn't coming from the walls, nor from the window, but from somewhere inside the room. It was too soft to be the door, and too consistent to be the wind. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I was just disoriented from waking up in an unfamiliar place. But the sound persisted. I turned my head toward the source, my eyes narrowing in the dark. At first, I thought it was the clock, but that didn't make sense. The sound wasn't coming from the direction of the nightstand. I shifted my gaze towards the corner of the room, where an old wooden chair sat near the window. It was a faint outline in the darkness, but the silhouette of it seemed to almost shift. I rubbed my eyes, wondering if I was still in that half-conscious state that comes from waking up in the middle of the night. But no, the chair was still there. And that's when it happened. The sound stopped, but in its place came a soft, barely perceptible dragging noise, like something heavy being moved across the floor. It was slow at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, closer to where I lay. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I slowly turned my head to glance over at my friends, but neither of them stirred. The dragging sound continued for a few seconds, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. An eerie silence followed, so thick it almost seemed suffocating. I waited for a while, my senses heightened, straining to hear anything else, but the only thing that filled the room was the sound of my own breathing. After what felt like an eternity, I cautiously sat up in bed, my legs dangling over the side. I could feel the cold from the floor seeping into my feet as I stood up, but I couldn't bring myself to move any further. I was frozen in place, my eyes flicking from one corner of the room to the next, trying to discern any signs of movement. But there was nothing. No sound, just the quiet hum of the building. I glanced back at my friends, both of them still sleeping soundly, oblivious to what had just happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The room felt different now, more oppressive, like the air was thick with something unseen. I stepped forward cautiously, my hand reaching out to touch the cold wooden chair, the same chair that had caught my attention earlier. It was just a chair, nothing more, but I couldn't help but feel that it had somehow moved. It was positioned differently than it had been when we first entered the room. I'm sure of it. I quickly turned my attention away from the chair and scanned the rest of the room, hoping that I was just imagining things. But then I saw something else, something even stranger. The window, which had been shut tightly when we arrived, was now slightly ajar. Not by much, just enough for a sliver of cold air to slip through, carrying with it the faint smell of dampness from the fog outside. I stepped over to the window, my heart racing, and pushed it shut again, making sure it was locked. I told myself it was nothing, just an old building settling, the wind playing tricks on me. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A faint whisper, so soft it was barely audible, seemed to come from the direction of the window. It was a sound like a breath, a voice just out of reach, too distant to understand. But I could feel it brushing against my ears, as though it was meant for me to hear. I froze, my hand still resting on the window latch, and held my breath, listening for anything else. The whisper stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving only silence in its wake. I turned toward my friends again, but they were still asleep. I wanted to wake them, tell them what I had heard, but something held me back. I wasn't sure how to explain it, how to make sense of what was happening. So I stood there for a moment, struggling with the fear that had begun to settle deep in my chest. I had no idea what to do next, but the one thing I knew for sure was that something was wrong. Something was in the room with us, something unseen, but undeniably present. After a few moments of hesitation, I slowly made my way back to my bed, keeping my eyes on the chair, the window, the shadows that seemed to gather in the corners. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that I wasn't alone. And though nothing more happened in those early hours of the morning, I couldn't bring myself to fall back asleep. The sounds, the whispers, the strange sensation in the air, they all lingered, filling my mind with unease. I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, trying to rationalize what had happened. Was it just my imagination? Was I sleep deprived? Or was there something more sinister at work? Whatever it was, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to forget the cold feeling of that room, the strange sounds, the unmistakable presence of something or someone else. When morning finally came, the first rays of light peeking through the curtains, I felt a slight relief. The sunlight seemed to wash away some of the lingering unease from the night, but deep down, I knew that whatever had happened in that room hadn't been my imagination. Something had changed. Something was still there. I could see my friends stirring, yawning, and stretching as the new day began, unaware of the strange events that had unfolded in the night. I didn't say anything. I wasn't sure how to explain it. The unease was still there, but I hoped that the daylight would somehow make it all feel normal again. But that hope quickly faded. The day had passed in a haze of unease, the bright sunlight outside doing little to dispel the growing tension inside the room. It wasn't just the strange events of the night that had left me unsettled. It was the persistent feeling that something was waiting for us, watching us. The unease lingered in the corners of the room like a heavy fog, suffocating the air, making every movement feel heavier, every breath more labored. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. My friends, still blissfully unaware of the eerie happenings of the night, had suggested we explore the surrounding area, take a hike in the woods behind the hotel, enjoy the fresh air. But no matter how beautiful the landscape seemed, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't the outside world I needed to be concerned about. The more I tried to distract myself, the stronger the sense of something being wrong became. It wasn't until the next evening that things truly began to escalate. That evening, after we returned to our room from dinner, something was off. The air felt too thick, too still, and I couldn't place the source of my growing dread. I stood near the window, staring out at the fog that had rolled in from the nearby hills, obscuring everything beyond the small hotel parking lot. The sky had turned an ominous shade of gray, and the wind had picked up, making the trees sway eerily in the distance. I tried to focus on the normalcy of it all, the setting sun, the rustling of leaves, but the room felt different. The lights flickered for a brief moment. It was subtle, but enough to make my pulse quicken. I turned around, looking for any sign of something, anything that could explain the strange energy in the room, but everything seemed normal. The beds were untouched, the chairs still in place, and the small desk sat in the corner as it had when we first arrived. Then the air grew colder again. Not just a slight chill, but a sharp, biting cold that settled around my skin, making me shiver despite being wrapped in a thick sweater. The temperature dropped so quickly that I felt as though I had stepped into a different world entirely, one where warmth had no place. I could see my breath in the air, a white mist that curled with every exhale. I knew for a fact that the heating system had been working perfectly before, but now the chill was so intense it felt like winter had suddenly arrived, despite it being late summer outside. I glanced over at my friends, who were engaged in their own conversation, completely oblivious to the strange atmosphere that had settled over the room. I had to say something. I had to make them aware, but how could I explain this feeling, this coldness, without sounding crazy? But then, just as I was about to speak, a loud crash sounded from the bathroom, followed by the unmistakable sound of something scraping against the floor. My heart skipped a beat. My friends froze in place, their eyes wide with surprise, as we all turned toward the bathroom door. My hand trembled as I reached for the light switch, flicking it on and off in a frantic attempt to break the tension that had now filled the room. For a moment, there was nothing. The room remained still, but the silence was unbearable, oppressive. Finally, one of my friends, with a nervous laugh, stood up and walked cautiously toward the bathroom door. "What the hell was that?" he muttered as he reached for the handle. I could hear his breath quickening, matching the pounding of my own heart in my chest. The door creaked open, and there, lying on the bathroom floor, was the small porcelain soap dish. It had fallen from the counter, its contents scattered across the floor as though it had been knocked over by something unseen. The strange thing, though, was the way it had landed. It wasn't just dropped, it had been thrown. The dish was overturned, but it looked as though it had slid a few feet across the floor, as though something had pushed it with force. We all stood there, staring at it in disbelief. The silence that followed was thick, too thick for comfort. None of us spoke for a long moment, all of us processing what we had just witnessed, until the other friend spoke in a low voice. "Did anyone see that move?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. He was staring at the dish as if it might leap up and attack us. This is getting weird. I wanted to brush it off, to tell them it was just an accident. But deep down, I knew this wasn't normal. This wasn't a simple slip of the hand or a faulty object. Something was happening, something that none of us could explain. As the night wore on, the strange occurrences continued. The lights flickered again, but this time they didn't come back on. The room remained dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside, casting long shadows across the floor. Then we heard it again, the sound of faint scraping, almost like fingernails dragging slowly across the surface of the desk. We couldn't ignore it anymore. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, my voice shaking. My friends exchanged nervous glances before we all moved toward the source of the sound. The desk was in the far corner, and as we approached, the scraping stopped. We reached for the lamp on the desk, flicking it on. The light revealed a mess of scattered papers and an overturned pen, but nothing that could explain the noise. "We've got to get out of here," one of my friends said, his voice tight with anxiety. "This place, it's not right." But I couldn't move. I couldn't leave. I had to figure out what was going on. I couldn't just run. I had to know what was happening, why the room felt like it was suffocating us. So we decided to investigate. At first, it was just the usual checks. The doors were locked, the windows shut, and there was nothing out of place in the room. But then we turned our attention to the hotel itself. The halls were eerily quiet, and as we stepped outside of our room, the air felt colder, heavier. We made our way to the front desk, hoping to speak with someone who might have answers, but the lobby was deserted. Not a soul in sight. The silence was deafening, the absence of life in the building more unsettling than anything we had encountered so far. The receptionist's desk was empty, and the door to the back office was slightly ajar, but there was no sign of anyone. As we stood there, trying to make sense of it all, a loud crash echoed through the hallways. It wasn't just a sound, it felt like it came from deep within the building. as though something had fallen or been thrown somewhere far behind the walls. The echo reverberated through the empty corridors, sending a chill down our spines. It was in that moment that we all realized we weren't just experiencing strange occurrences in our room. The entire building felt off, as if it was alive, aware of our presence, and determined to keep us from leaving. The feeling of being watched, of something moving just beyond our reach, intensified. And that's when we knew we had to get to the bottom of this, no matter what. I've never been more terrified in my life. It wasn't just the strange noises, the cold, or the flickering lights. It wasn't even the eerie feeling that settled in my chest, like a weight, heavy and suffocating. No, what terrified me the most was what we found in the basement. We hadn't meant to go down there. We hadn't planned for it. But after hours of strange occurrences, after listening to doors creak and hearing faint whispers that we couldn't place, we knew we had to know more. Something was happening in this hotel, and it was happening to us. We could feel it. The hotel staff had disappeared at least. We hadn't seen anyone in hours, and the place was eerily quiet. As we explored, we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. It was like the walls themselves were closing in, like something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for us to make the wrong move. Our decision to go to the basement had been impulsive, driven by a desperation for answers. We'd noticed a door in the far corner of the lobby, a door we hadn't seen before. It was almost like it had appeared out of nowhere. There were no signs, no indications of where it led, just an old, heavy door with rusted hinges. The door was unlocked. Without saying a word, we moved toward it, each of us unsure but unwilling to back down now. The air grew colder with every step we took. The dark hallway stretched on, seemingly endless, but we pressed forward. As we descended the stairs, the old wooden steps creaked beneath our weight. The temperature dropped with each step, and by the time we reached the bottom, the cold was biting, sharp enough to make us shiver. The basement was unlike anything I had imagined. It was vast, larger than the hotel itself. It seemed filled with rows of old, dusty crates and stacks of forgotten furniture. The smell of mildew and stale air made my throat tighten. But that wasn't what stopped us in our tracks. It was the shadows. At first, we thought it was our eyes adjusting to the darkness, but the longer we stood there, the more we realized something was moving. The shadows shifted unnaturally, swirling as if they were alive. And they weren't just moving, they were reaching toward us, as though they had a mind of their own. It felt as if the very air around us was alive, suffocating, watching. I felt my heart race in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I turned to my friends, but they were just as frozen as I was. None of us could speak. It was like the room itself had swallowed our voices. That's when we saw it. In the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light, was a large old mirror. It was covered in dust and grime, but it seemed out of place, as if it had been waiting for us. We approached it slowly, the silence deafening, each step heavier than the last. And then we saw it. A reflection. But it wasn't ours. It wasn't us standing in front of the mirror. The figure in the reflection wasn't human. It was a dark silhouette, its features barely visible, but twisted and wrong, like it was trying to form itself into something familiar. The shape lurched toward us, and for a moment, I felt like I couldn't breathe. My body froze in terror, my legs shaking so badly I could hardly stand. One of my friends reached out to touch the mirror, his hand trembling. The moment his fingers brushed the glass, a loud bang echoed through the basement, followed by a blood-curdling scream. The reflection in the mirror distorted, the figure becoming more defined, its eyes glowing with a faint, sickly green light. It wasn't a reflection at all. It was a presence, a thing that was using the mirror to manifest itself in our world. The thing in the mirror wasn't just watching us, it was planning something, waiting for the right moment. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, to get out of there as fast as possible, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. The thing in the mirror began to stretch toward us, its long, gnarled hands reaching out like claws. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, threatening to burst from the pressure. Then, in an instant, everything changed. The room seemed to pulse, as if the walls themselves were alive, the temperature plummeting further, plunging us into an unnatural cold. The mirrors shattered with a loud crash, the pieces falling to the floor like shards of ice. The lights flickered violently, casting strange shadows across the room, making it impossible to tell where the shadows ended and where the darkness began. A deafening silence filled the room, and in that silence I could hear it. The whispering. It wasn't in my ears. It was in my head. Low and guttural, the voices whispered words I couldn't understand, as though they were coming from deep within the walls, deep within the hotel itself. The sound was maddening, and I felt my sanity slipping away. Without warning, the shadows rushed toward us. The last thing I remember is the coldness enveloping me as something grabbed hold of my arm, its fingers ice cold and unyielding. Then, everything went black. The silence in the room was suffocating. No one spoke. We just sat there, huddled together on the bed, the only sound being the erratic thumping of our hearts. It felt as if the hotel itself was holding its breath, waiting for us to make a decision. I could feel the heaviness in the air, the same feeling I had when we first arrived. It wasn't just the hotel's dilapidation or its age. It was something darker, something ancient that had been embedded in the walls. The voices from the basement echoed in my mind, louder now that I was awake, reminding me of what we had encountered down there. The thing in the mirror, the shadows, it was all real. And whatever it wasn't done with us. What do we do now? One of my friends whispered, breaking the silence. The question was simple, but the weight of it felt unbearable. We had no idea what to do. Our minds were scrambled, still reeling from the chaos that had erupted in the basement. The mirror, the shadows, the feeling that we were being watched, it was all too much. And yet, we couldn't ignore it. It had marked us, whether we liked it or not. The hotel room, despite being the closest thing to safety we had, felt just as oppressive as the basement. The same coldness clung to the air, and the walls seemed to close in on us. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for us just beyond the door. Something we couldn't escape. "We need to leave," I finally said, the words feeling foreign as they left my lips. It was the only thing that made sense. Whatever had happened in that basement, whatever had been unleashed, we couldn't stay here. We had to get out. But leaving wasn't as simple as walking out the door. The moment I said those words, we all realized something at the same time. The door to our room was locked. Not just locked, but sealed. The doorknob wouldn't turn. We tried every possible way to open it, panic setting in as we realized it wasn't just a malfunctioning lock. It was something more. The door was trapping us inside. The cold grew colder, and the shadows seemed to creep closer, pressing against the walls like they were alive. I felt a knot form in my stomach. We weren't going to get out. At least, not the way we thought we would. I turned to my friends. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with fear, but none of us spoke. We all knew what had to be done. We had to face whatever was holding us in this room, and we had to do it now before it was too late. The first thing we tried was the window. It was locked too. But unlike the door, the window was thick with grime, and I had no doubt that it had been years, decades, maybe since anyone had tried to open it. We tried to break it, but the glass was too thick, too strong. It was as if the hotel itself was fighting against us. We could hear strange noises in the hall now. Soft, low murmurs, like a voice, but not quite human. It echoed, reverberating in the walls around us. I felt my chest tighten. Whatever was in this place, it was moving, shifting. It knew we were trying to leave, and it wasn't going to make it easy for us. The tension in the room was palpable. No one spoke. We just moved as if we were all connected by some invisible thread, each of us knowing what needed to be done, but none of us willing to say it aloud. I could feel the temperature dropping even further. My breath fogged in front of me, and the walls creaked as if the building was groaning in protest. It felt as if the very foundation of the hotel was shaking, as if something was stirring deep below the surface. I turned toward the only other exit, the bathroom. It was small, the mirror fogged from the cold, but there was something different about it now. It wasn't the same as before. It didn't feel like a regular bathroom mirror. It felt like something more. Something that could trap us, just like the door. I stared into it for a moment, hypnotized by the fogged-up glass. And then I saw it. A face. Not mine. Not anyone's in the room. It was a distorted, twisted version of a face, like it had been melted or deformed. Its eyes were dark, hollow, and unblinking, staring right at me. My body went rigid with fear. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't a reflection. It wasn't an illusion. It was real, and it was watching us. Panic gripped me, and I backed away from the bathroom, almost knocking over a lamp in my haste. My friends were right behind me, all of us trapped in the same nightmare. We weren't just in a haunted hotel anymore. We were inside something else. Something old, something ancient. It was trying to hold us here, to keep us as part of its twisted world. I don't know how long we stood there, paralyzed by fear, waiting for anything to happen. The minutes seemed to stretch into hours. The noises outside the door grew louder, more frantic, like something was pounding against the walls, begging to be let in. The room grew colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly that it felt like we were being encased in ice. Then, without warning, the door creaked. It didn't open, but the lock clicked, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. The door. It was unlocked. We rushed toward it. Desperation surged through me, and I yanked the door open. The hallway beyond was dark, but we didn't hesitate. We ran without looking back. The sound of our footsteps echoed in the empty corridor, growing louder, as if something was chasing us. We made it outside. The night air was cold, crisp, and sharp against our skin. We didn't care. We didn't stop to think about anything except getting as far away from that place as possible. The hotel loomed behind us, silent and still, but I could feel it. I could feel it watching us, waiting for us to come back. And I knew, deep in my gut, that we hadn't escaped. Whatever was in that place, whatever had been keeping us trapped, it wasn't finished with us yet. We drove away, but I couldn't shake the feeling. The hotel was still there, somewhere, its doors open, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to walk in. And we had no way of knowing if we would ever be truly free. We drove for what felt like hours, but I couldn't bring myself to look back. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see the hotel's looming structure still there, dark and waiting for us to return. The air outside was cold and still, and the hum of the engine did little to calm the storm inside my chest. My friends and I didn't speak much during the drive. None of us had the words. We were all too shaken, too broken by what had happened to process anything. As we sped down the road, the landscape changed from the dense forest surrounding the hotel to a more familiar, quieter part of the countryside. It should have been comforting, but all it did was remind me of how far we had to go to feel safe again. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, we reached the nearest town. It was late, well past midnight, and the streets were empty, save for the dim glow of streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. We stopped at a small diner, the only place still open, and stumbled in, our bodies weary, our minds frazzled. I couldn't even bring myself to order food. I just needed something to numb the cold that had settled deep in my bones, something to wash away the fear that seemed to cling to me like a second skin. As we sat there, drinking coffee that barely touched the chill in my soul, I tried to process what had happened. I needed answers. What had that hotel been? What had we encountered down there? What was that thing in the mirror? But every time I tried to put the pieces together, the memories seemed to slip through my fingers like water. The details became hazy, distorted. The more I tried to remember, the more I realized that I didn't want to. Whatever had happened, Whatever we had experienced in that place, I didn't need to understand it. I just needed to forget. We stayed in the diner until the sun began to rise. The warmth of the daylight felt foreign, like a gift I didn't deserve. It was a new day, a new start, and for a moment, it felt like the terror of the night before was nothing more than a bad dream. But that feeling didn't last. When I got home, I tried to settle back into my daily life, but nothing felt the same. The sounds of the city, the ordinary routine of work and errands, all seemed distant, as if I were watching it from behind a thick pane of glass. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every shadow seemed to twitch with movement. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like something or someone lurking just out of sight. I tried to call my friends, to check in, to make sure we were all okay. But their voices on the other end of the line sounded strange. They weren't the same as before. They seemed hollow, distant, as if they too were haunted by the same terror. And every time I asked them if they were okay, the response was the same. "We don't want to talk about it." I couldn't blame them. I didn't want to talk about it either. In the weeks that followed, I tried to push the memories of the hotel to the back of my mind. I tried to live like I had before, but I couldn't. The nightmares started soon after we left. At first, they were small whispers in the dark, fleeting glimpses of shadows in the corner of my vision, but soon they escalated. I would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, feeling as if something was watching me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that mirror again, that twisted face staring back at me, its hollow eyes locked on mine. I knew I couldn't escape it. Whatever we had encountered in that place had followed me. It had marked me, and I didn't know how to get rid of it. I found myself avoiding mirrors altogether, walking around my house with my back to any reflective surface, terrified that if I looked into one, I'd see that same face again alive, waiting, ready to drag me back into the nightmare. But it wasn't just the mirrors. There were other things too. The sounds, the whispers, the feeling that something was moving just out of reach, something that knew I was here. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't logical. It wasn't real, not in the way I understood reality. But I knew what I felt, and I wasn't the only one. One day, I ran into one of my friends at a local store. They looked different, tired, haunted, just like me. Their eyes darted around nervously, as if they were expecting something to appear behind them. When we spoke, it was strained, forced. I could tell they wanted to ask me the same question I had been asking myself for weeks. Are you still hearing it? Are you still feeling it? But neither of us said it out loud. We didn't need to. We parted ways quickly, and I never saw them again. A few months later, I received a letter. It was from one of my other friends who had been with us at the hotel. The letter was simple, short, but the words burned into my mind. "I've had enough. I can't do this anymore. It's following me. It won't stop." I never heard from them again. Now, I don't know what happened to them. Maybe they're still out there, still running from whatever we unleashed that night. Or maybe they found a way to escape. I don't know. All I know is that I can't stop thinking about that hotel, about what it was, about what it wanted from us. It was a late summer afternoon when I first heard about the abandoned amusement park. I had just moved to a small town in the Midwest, a place where life moved at a slow, predictable pace. The streets were lined with old brick buildings, some of which had been there for as long as anyone could remember. In the middle of this quiet town was a large, dilapidated plot of land that had once been home to a bustling amusement park. Now, the rusting skeleton of what was once a place of joy stood abandoned and forgotten. My friends and I had grown up on stories of the park, how it used to be the pride of the town, attracting visitors from all over. But over the years, it had fallen into disrepair, and eventually, it closed its gates for good. The locals would tell tales of the park's mysterious decline, some claiming it had been shut down due to unfortunate accidents, while others whispered about something far darker. But like most people, I never paid much attention to those rumors. After all, they were just stories, weren't they? I remember the day I first saw it for myself. The old Ferris wheel loomed in the distance, half buried in the overgrown weeds that had overtaken the grounds. The faded paint on the carousel horses made them look like they had been forgotten by time itself. The once vibrant colors of the park were now muted and gray, the air thick with the scent of rust and decay. My friends and I were sitting at a diner when the conversation turned to the park. "Have you guys ever thought about going there?" Tom, a guy I'd recently become friends with, asked. He had that adventurous look in his eyes, the kind of guy who would willingly take a dare. He had moved to town a few months before I did, and we'd hit it off after talking about our shared interest in local history. "I've heard it's haunted," Matt said, his voice lowering slightly, though there was a hint of amusement in his tone. "That place has a reputation." "Haunted?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. I wasn't a big believer in the supernatural, but the idea of exploring an old, abandoned amusement park intrigued me. "Well, it's not just the locals who say it's haunted," Tom chimed in. "There are actual reports of strange happenings. People going missing, weird noises, lights flickering in the middle of the night. It's a little unsettling." "Sounds like a good place for a horror movie," I said, shaking my head, but I could sense the excitement building in my chest. There was something about the idea of visiting a place that had been abandoned for so long that felt like it could be the adventure I had been waiting for. "You guys should come with me," Tom said, leaning forward as if it were already settled. "We can check it out this weekend. Who knows, maybe we'll find something interesting." And just like that, we made a plan. The weekend came quickly, and the four of us, Tom, Matt, Jake, and I found ourselves standing at the edge of the overgrown parking lot that once served as the entrance to the amusement park. The air was heavy with humidity, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant chirping of crickets. I took in the sight before me. The gate was still there, though it was barely standing. A once colorful sign that said Sunset Valley Amusement Park hung crookedly above the entrance, its bright lettering now faded and peeling. I could already tell that this wasn't going to be your typical weekend adventure. "What do you think?" Matt asked, eyeing the gate warily. "It's definitely eerie," I replied, my voice a little more cautious than I had intended. "But I'm all for exploring." Tom was already walking toward the gate, his camera in hand, clearly excited. "Come on, guys. This is exactly what we came for." The atmosphere was strange, almost oppressive, as we stepped onto the grounds. The once paved walkways were now cracked and covered in grass, the structures around us worn down by years of neglect. The Ferris wheel stood motionless in the distance, its massive frame casting long shadows over the land. The carousel was just beyond it, its horses frozen in place, their glass eyes staring vacantly. We made our way deeper into the park, the sounds of the outside world fading behind us. It was as if we had stepped into a different time, a time when the park was alive with the laughter of children and the sounds of carnival music. Now it was silent, save for the occasional creak of old metal and the soft rustling of the trees. "I can't believe we're actually here," Jake said, breaking the silence. "This place feels off." "Yeah," I agreed, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was something about the place that made me uneasy. Maybe it was the stillness, or maybe it was the way everything seemed to be frozen in time, as if waiting for something or someone to come along and wake it up. We wandered further, the abandoned rides standing like empty monuments to a bygone era. The sky was growing darker, and the air felt colder than it had when we first arrived. "Let's head toward the Ferris wheel," Tom suggested, his voice full of excitement. "That's where the best shots will be." As we walked, The park seemed to come alive with an eerie energy, the wind picking up slightly, causing the rusted rides to creak and groan as if protest our presence. The air grew thicker, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the shadows. Little did I know, this would be just the beginning. The sense of unease I felt would soon evolve into something far darker, something I wasn't prepared for. The chill in the air had become more pronounced as we made our way past the carousel and toward the Ferris wheel. I couldn't shake the odd feeling that had been growing inside me, a sense of discomfort that gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. Everything around us seemed still, almost too still. The park, once full of laughter and bright lights, was now nothing more than a graveyard of memories. The Ferris wheel loomed ahead, its rusted skeleton towering over the crumbling paths. It was then that I noticed something strange, something that seemed almost impossible given the state of the park. A light. At first, I dismissed it as nothing more than a trick of the fading daylight. A reflection, maybe, or the dim glow of a distant street lamp. But as we drew closer, I could see it more clearly, faint, but steady, like a single light flickering from within one of the old gondolas. Did anyone else see that? I asked, my voice betraying a hint of uncertainty. Matt was the first to respond, though his tone suggested he was more confused than concerned. What do you mean? The light? I pointed toward the Ferris wheel. In one of the gondolas, it's flickering. Tom, always the enthusiast for anything remotely strange, squinted toward the ride. That's odd, he said, stepping forward with his camera in hand. Let's get closer. Maybe we can figure out what it is. We moved in closer, our footsteps echoing on the cracked pavement. I could feel the cold creeping up my spine as the light flickered again, casting long, eerie shadows across the dilapidated park. The closer we got, the more I felt the weight of the place pressing in on me. Everything felt heavier now, like the park itself was holding its breath. It's probably just a broken light or something, Matt said, trying to reassure himself as much as us. This place has been abandoned for years. But the longer we stared at the Ferris wheel, the more unsettling the flickering light became. It was coming from the gondola on the far side, the one that hung the lowest, swaying slightly in the wind. The wind, I noticed, had picked up, rustling the leaves of the overgrown grass around us, but it didn't feel natural. There was a heaviness to it, as if the air itself was waiting for something. Tom raised his camera, preparing to snap a picture. This is perfect, he said, his voice filled with excitement. I can't wait to show this to the guys back at the diner. But then, just as he pressed the button, the light stopped flickering altogether. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, everything was completely still. I looked around, half expecting someone to jump out of the shadows and start laughing. But no one did. What the hell was that? I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. Tom lowered his camera, staring at the gondola in disbelief. Did it just stop? I don't know, I said, my voice barely above a murmur. It was flickering 1 second, and then nothing. We all stood there, staring at the Ferris wheel as though expecting it to start moving at any moment. But it remained eerily still, the gondola frozen in place, the light now completely gone. It was as if it had never been there at all. Maybe it's just a malfunction, Matt suggested, his voice tense. Old, abandoned park. Lights probably go haywire all the time. Yeah, but that doesn't explain why it stopped right when we got close, I said, glancing around at the others. It was like it was waiting for us to notice. That's ridiculous, Tom laughed nervously. You're overthinking it, but we can come back and check it out later. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to laugh it off as nothing more than an odd coincidence, a malfunction of some old equipment. But something in the back of my mind was telling me that this wasn't just a broken light. It was something more, something deeper, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we had stirred something in the park, something that was watching us. We continued toward the Ferris wheel, but the closer we got, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It was as if the park itself had come alive in some unsettling way, drawing us in like moths to a flame. The wind seemed to carry a whisper, though I couldn't make out any words. It felt as though something was just beyond the veil, waiting to reveal itself. As we passed the base of the Ferris wheel, I glanced up at the gondola that had flickered earlier. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, just a brief shadow, but enough to make my heart skip a beat. I stopped dead in my tracks. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice low and tight with fear. Tom, who had been leading the way, turned around. "See what?" "I don't know," I said, swallowing hard. "It was like someone moved in the gondola." "Just for a second," Matt scoffed, though it sounded forced. "You're imagining things, man. It's just an old, abandoned park. Nothing's here but dust and rust." But even as he spoke, I could tell he wasn't convinced. He looked over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the darkening surroundings, as if trying to reassure himself that we weren't alone. "I don't know," I muttered, my unease growing. "It just feels like something's wrong here." At that moment, we heard a loud noise, a sharp, metallic clang that seemed to come from somewhere deeper in the park. It sounded like metal scraping against metal, a noise that shouldn't have been there. We all froze, our eyes wide with alarm. Tom immediately lifted his camera again, though his hands were trembling slightly now. "What the hell was that?" Matt asked, his voice shaky. "I don't know," Tom replied, though his usual bravado was gone. "Let's go check it out." We moved toward the sound, our footsteps careful and deliberate. The air felt thicker now, as if the atmosphere had changed somehow. The wind had died down, leaving an almost unnatural stillness in its wake. The further we walked, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone lurking in the shadows. As we rounded the corner of an old snack stand, we stopped dead in our tracks. The source of the noise was immediately apparent. The gate to the old roller coaster had swung open. It was a large, rusted iron gate that had been closed tightly when we first arrived, but now it was wide open, creaking on its hinges. The noise we had heard earlier, the scraping sound, had been the gate swinging open, though none of us had seen it move. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I stared at the gate, unsure of what to make of it. We had all been standing at the Ferris wheel just moments before, and there was no way the gate could have opened by itself. "That wasn't open before," Matt said, his voice tight with tension. "I saw it closed when we walked by," I replied, my throat dry. "So how the hell did it open?" Tom moved forward slowly, his camera still in hand. "Let's go check it out," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier enthusiasm. I followed him, my steps hesitant, and Matt and Jake followed behind me, each of us caught in the web of unease that had descended upon the park. As we approached the gate, I felt the temperature drop even further, and a strange shiver ran down my spine. The air was heavy now, almost suffocating, as if something was pressing down on us from above. It wasn't just the cold that made me uneasy, it was the sense that we weren't alone anymore. Something or someone was out there in the dark, waiting. And then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed from within the roller coaster, muffled but distinct. It was the sound of someone walking. Slowly. We stopped in our tracks, our hearts racing. The footsteps stopped. I could hear my heart thundering in my chest, drowning out the sounds of the world around us. The air seemed to grow heavier, thicker with each passing second. I glanced around, my mind scrambling for an explanation, any explanation, but there was none. The park, once silent and abandoned, now felt alive with tension, as if the very ground beneath us was holding its breath. Tom was the first to speak, his voice a strained whisper. "Did you hear that? Someone's inside." We all stood frozen, the gate in front of us looming like the entrance to another world, one that we weren't sure we should enter. The footsteps had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching us from the shadows. Matt took a deep breath, clearly trying to shake off his own unease. "It's probably just an animal, maybe a raccoon or something," but I didn't believe him. The sound was too deliberate, too measured. It wasn't the scurrying of an animal, it was the slow, purposeful tread of a person. Someone was out there. We need to go check it out, Tom said, determination creeping back into his voice, despite the unease that lingered in the air. He started moving forward, his camera raised, but none of us followed immediately. Are you out of your mind? I asked, my voice sharp, a mix of fear and disbelief. We don't even know who or what that is. Tom turned to look at me, his face pale in the dimming light. Look, we're already here. We came to find something, and we need to know what's going on. If we leave now, we'll never know what's really happening here. His words were convincing in their own way, but the dread that had settled in my stomach was growing harder to ignore. The darkness was spreading around us, thickening like a fog that was closing in. We're not alone, I said quietly, as if admitting it would somehow make it real. The words sent a shiver down my spine. Tom, however, seemed resolute. We're going to figure this out. The others reluctantly followed his lead, and we stepped forward toward the open gate. The air was unnaturally cold, even though it was late spring, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I crossed the threshold. I glanced back over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone lurking behind us in the shadows, but the park remained silent. The sound of the wind rustling through the overgrown grass was the only noise that reached my ears. We moved deeper into the roller coaster's abandoned grounds, the fading daylight making everything appear more menacing. The coaster tracks, twisted and rusted with years of neglect, seemed to stretch on forever, disappearing into the growing darkness. The air smelled of damp earth and decaying metal, a sharp, metallic scent that made my stomach turn. It wasn't long before we heard something again this time. It was a low scraping noise, like metal dragging across concrete. It sent a jolt of fear through me, and I froze mid-step. My eyes darted around the area, searching for the source of the sound, but I saw nothing out of the ordinary. The others seemed just as unsettled, but Tom pushed forward, his camera now hanging loosely by his side. Did you hear that? Matt asked, his voice tight. Yeah, I answered, my throat dry. But I don't see anything. The scraping noise stopped suddenly, replaced by a low creak, like the sound of a heavy door moving on its hinges. It seemed to come from the roller coaster station, an old, decaying building that loomed ahead of us. There was no mistaking the sound now. It was as if someone or something was inside, moving through the ruins of the old station. Let's check it out, Tom urged, though I could tell he was no longer as confident as he had been moments ago. We approached the station cautiously, every step feeling heavier than the last. The smell of rust and decay grew stronger as we neared the entrance, and the once pristine white paint on the building's walls was chipped and peeling, exposing the bare wood beneath. The door was slightly ajar, the hinges groaning under the weight of its age. Should we go in? Matt asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tom looked back at us, his eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and fear. We have to. We need to know what's going on here. I hesitated, but after a moment, I nodded. It wasn't like we could leave now. Not after everything we had already seen. Not after the strange lights and the footsteps. We had come this far. We had to see it through. We stepped inside. The interior of the station was darker than I expected, and the air felt thick with dust. Old ticket booths lined the walls, their glass windows cracked and dirty. Broken wooden planks littered the floor, and everything had the unmistakable scent of mold and rot. The silence was deafening. It was as if the building had been abandoned for decades, and yet something didn't feel right. There was an oppressive weight in the air, an undeniable sense that we were not alone. Hello, Tom called out, his voice echoing off the walls. Is anyone here? No response. We moved deeper into the station, the beam of Tom's flashlight illuminating the dark corners of the room. The walls were covered with old, faded posters of past rides and attractions, their colors long since washed out. There was an unsettling stillness to it all. No movement, no sounds. Just the quiet rustling of the wind outside. Do you hear that? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. We all stopped, straining our ears. At first, there was nothing. But then, Faintly, almost imperceptibly, we heard it a soft, rhythmic thud, like footsteps moving across the floor above us. We all exchanged nervous glances. "Upstairs," Matt whispered. "Someone's up there." Without waiting for anyone's response, Tom moved toward the stairs, his camera raised in front of him like some kind of shield. The stairs creaked under our weight as we ascended, the sound reverberating throughout the building. The upper floor was even darker than the main level, the only light coming from the beam of Tom's flashlight. There was a long hallway ahead of us, with doors on either side. It felt like we were walking into the heart of something that had been lying dormant for years, just waiting for us to stumble upon it. My pulse raced, and I could feel the weight of the air pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. As we walked further down the hallway, I couldn't help but feel like we were being drawn deeper into the building, like it was pulling us in. I could feel my skin crawling as if something or someone was watching us from behind the walls. Every step seemed to echo louder, sharper, as if the building was listening. And then, just as we reached the end of the hall, the sound of footsteps returned. But this time, they were louder, closer. It was unmistakable. The footsteps grew louder, each step echoing off the narrow, decaying walls of the hallway. My heart pounded in my chest, the thudding sound nearly drowning out everything else. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a trick of the wind. The footsteps were deliberate, heavy, and unmistakably human. But the question lingered, who could it be? No one should be here. No one could be here. I glanced at the others, their faces a mixture of terror and disbelief. Tom's hand was shaking as he raised his flashlight, its beam wavering unsteadily as he pointed it down the hallway. I could hear his breath quicken, his usual bravado slipping away with every passing second. Matt, who had been silent since we entered the building, was gripping the handle of his camera so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice hoarse. The urgency in my tone made it sound more like a plea than a command, but no one moved. We were all frozen, caught in a trap of our own making. The footsteps grew louder still, until they were so close that I could feel the vibrations through the floorboards. And then, in an instant, they stopped. I held my breath. The silence that followed was suffocating, oppressive. It felt like the air itself had thickened, each second dragging by like an eternity. My chest tightened, and for a moment, I thought I might suffocate from the sheer weight of the stillness. "What's happening?" Matt whispered, his voice barely audible. Tom stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the dark corner at the end of the hallway. There was something about the way he moved, his body rigid, like he was being drawn towards something against his will. I wanted to shout at him to stop, to turn around and run, but I couldn't speak. It was as if the building itself had stolen my voice. "Tom, stop." I managed to croak, but he didn't respond. His eyes were locked on someone just out of sight. Suddenly, a door creaked open. The sound was sharp, like a knife slicing through the tension that had been building in the air. I jumped back, instinctively grabbing Matt's arm. But Tom was already moving toward the open door, his steps slow and cautious, his flashlight raised. I could see the flicker of the light as it swept across the floor, illuminating the edges of the room beyond. A figure stood in the doorway. I don't know what I expected, but it wasn't this. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, its outline distorted in the flickering light. I could make out the faintest shape of a person, but there was something off about it, something wrong. The air around it seemed to shimmer, like the temperature had dropped suddenly, and the shadows twisted unnaturally, clinging to the edges of the figure's form. "Who are you?" Tom called out, his voice trembling, but his bravado returning in a thin veneer. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, motionless, as if it were waiting for something. Its face was obscured in darkness, but I could feel its presence, like an electric charge in the air, crackling with menace. My skin prickled, and my stomach churned with an overwhelming sense of dread. Tom took a step closer. The others and I stood frozen, paralyzed by fear, unable to do anything but watch. There was a sinking feeling in my gut, an undeniable instinct telling me that whatever this was, it wasn't human. It couldn't be. "Who are you?" Tom repeated, his voice now barely above a whisper. His confidence had completely evaporated. The figure didn't move, but I could see a faint glimmer of something in the corner of the room, a reflection, perhaps shimmering in the darkness. It was like a mirror, but it wasn't right. The surface seemed to ripple, as though the reflection wasn't solid, but instead a distorted image of what was real. And then, without warning, the figure moved. It was faster than any human should be able to move. In the blink of an eye, it crossed the room, its shape blurring with unnatural speed. My blood ran cold. I tried to scream, but my voice failed me again. The figure reached Tom. I saw it grab him, its long fingers wrapping around his arm with an iron grip, pulling him into the darkness of the room. He struggled, his flashlight slipping from his hand and rolling across the floor, casting erratic beams of light as it spun. "Tom!" I screamed, finally finding my voice. I lunged forward, but Matt grabbed my arm, holding me back. "No," Matt hissed, panic evident in his voice. "Don't go near it." "Won't!" But I couldn't stop myself. I pulled away from his grip and ran toward the door. The others hesitated, but when they saw what I was doing, they followed. We reached the door just as the figure vanished into the room, taking Tom with it. For a moment, there was complete silence. No movement, no sound. "Tom!" I shouted again, my voice cracking with fear and desperation. But there was no answer. It was like he had been swallowed by the darkness itself. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, too afraid to move, too afraid to even breathe. And then the room went dark. The flashlight, which had been rolling across the floor, had finally stopped, leaving us in complete blackness. I could hear nothing but the pounding of my own heart in my ears, drowning out the sound of my breaths. "Where did it go?" Matt asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But we have to find Tom. We can't leave him here." But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Whatever had taken him wasn't something we could fight or reason with. It wasn't human. It wasn't even something from this world. There was no escape. "Let's go," I said, my voice steely with determination. "We're getting Tom out of here." But as we stepped into the room, I felt something cold brush past me, and I turned just in time to see the door slam shut, locking us inside. We were trapped. The darkness pressed in from all sides, suffocating us. We couldn't see anything, but we could hear it, the soft shuffle of movement, the quiet whispers in the dark. The walls seemed to close in around us, and I could feel the air growing colder, thinner, as if we were losing ourselves to the void. And then, through the silence, came the laughter. It was soft at first, a low, guttural sound that reverberated through the room, and then it grew louder. It was a chilling, otherworldly sound, as if something that shouldn't exist was mocking us, taunting us for our foolishness. It was then that I realized we weren't going to leave this place. The darkness was absolute. I could feel the weight of it pressing against my skin, suffocating me with each breath. The cold had seeped into my bones, chilling me from the inside out. I reached out, my fingers brushing the rough, decaying walls of the room, as if touching something tangible could anchor me to reality. The laughter still echoed in the dark, growing louder, more distorted with each passing second. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a presence, a suffocating force that filled every corner of the room. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a reminder that we were still trapped, still at the mercy of whatever had taken Tom. But even in my terror, I knew something had shifted. The very air around us seemed different, charged with a strange, almost palpable energy. "Matt," I said, my voice barely audible. My throat was dry, and the words felt like they were being pulled from deep within, as if my body didn't want to let them escape. Matt was next to me, his body stiff with fear, his breath shallow and uneven. He didn't respond, but I felt the tension in him. I turned, looking for any sign of Tom. It was futile, of course. The room was still dark, the air thick with dread. Yet I couldn't help but hope that Tom was still out there, somewhere, that we hadn't lost him forever. But a deeper part of me, a part that had been growing louder since we first entered the building, told me it was too late. The door, the one we had just seen slam shut, remained sealed. It had locked itself, trapping us inside with no way out. My fingers trembled as I reached for the handle, but there was no give. It was as if the door itself had become part of the wall, a part of the building, merging with it in a way that defied logic. The only thing we had left was the darkness, and whatever waited within it. "Don't," Matt whispered suddenly, his voice strained, almost pleading. "Don't touch it again." I stepped back, reluctantly pulling my hand away from the door. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice breaking. "We can't stay here. We have to find a way out." I looked back at the room, my eyes scanning the darkness, hoping for any sign of movement, any clue as to where Tom had gone. But the room was still. The laughter had stopped, replaced by the sound of our breathing, the oppressive silence pressing in on all sides. I don't know," Matt muttered. "We need to leave. We need to leave now before." Before what? Before the thing that had taken Tom came for us next? Before the building swallowed us whole too? The words hung in the air, unspoken but understood by both of us. I wanted to run. I wanted to turn around and flee, to leave this place behind and never look back. But the oppressive presence in the room kept us rooted in place, unwilling to let us go. It was as if the building itself had decided that we belonged to it now, that we were part of its haunting, part of its twisted history. Suddenly, a flicker of light, a soft, erratic glow in the corner of the room caught my eye. It wasn't much, a faint shimmer, but it was enough to draw me in. It wasn't the flashlight we had dropped earlier. It wasn't a reflection from outside. It was something else, something more. Matt's eyes followed mine, his expression one of disbelief. "What is that?" I couldn't answer him. I could only move toward it, my legs shaking beneath me as I took a tentative step forward. The air grew colder, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end as I approached the source of the light. The glow seemed to pulse, as if it were alive, as if it were calling to me, drawing me in. And then, as I stepped closer, it revealed itself. It was a mirror, no, not a mirror, not really. It was a distortion of reality itself, a warped reflection of the room, of the hallway, of the entire building. The edges shimmered and twisted, as if the surface were made of liquid instead of glass. I could see myself in it, but the reflection wasn't quite right. My features were blurred, out of focus, and I could feel my heart skip a beat as I realized the reflection was not just mine, it was ours. And there, in the reflection, I saw him. Tom. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, but there was something wrong with him. He wasn't just standing in the reflection, he was trapped in it, as though he were encased within the glass, his body twisted in unnatural angles, his mouth opening and closing, as if he were trying to scream, but no sound came out. His hands pressed against the glass, but the surface resisted, as if he were trapped behind it. "Tom," I gasped, reaching out, but as my hand neared the glass, the reflection shifted. Tom's image seemed to flicker and distort, his face twisting in pain, and I heard the faintest echo of his voice, distorted and distant. "Help me," the voice whispered, but it wasn't really his voice. It was something else, something wrong. I recoiled, my heart hammering in my chest. "We have to get out of here. Now." My voice was urgent, panic creeping in. I spun toward Matt, but he was frozen, his eyes locked on the mirror, unable or unwilling to look away. We both stood there, staring at the warped reflection of Tom, both paralyzed by fear, the urge to run battling with the need to understand, to know what had happened to him, to us. But there were no answers. Only the unsettling reality that the figure in the mirror was not the Tom we had known. It was something else entirely. The moment stretched on for what felt like forever, the tension unbearable. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the mirror flickered one last time. The distorted image of Tom faded, and the reflection of the room returned to normal. The light from the mirror dimmed and then extinguished entirely, leaving us in total darkness once again. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Was it real? Was it a hallucination brought on by fear? Or had the building truly done something to Tom, trapping him in that twisted reflection? I looked at Matt. His face was ashen, his lips parted as if he were trying to speak, but couldn't find the words. "We need to get out of here," I repeated, my voice shaking with the weight of what had just happened. But we both knew that escape wasn't possible. Not from this place. Not from whatever had claimed Tom. We turned toward the door again. This time, there was no hesitation. I gripped the handle, and to my surprise, it gave way. The door opened, creaking on its hinges, as if it had been waiting for us. We stepped into the hallway, our footsteps echoing in the empty space. But as we moved toward the exit, the building seemed to groan, its walls shifting, stretching as if alive. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if it were pressing against us, unwilling to let us leave. I felt an overwhelming urge to run, but I forced myself to move steadily, one step after another. We reached the front door. I pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in. I pulled harder, my muscles straining, but it was no use. The door had locked itself again. We were trapped, just as we had been from the beginning. And then I heard it a whisper, soft and distant, but unmistakable. "You should never have come here." We turned, but there was no one there. The hallway behind us was empty, but the voice lingered in the air, a chill that crawled up my spine. The building had claimed us. It was never going to let us go. We didn't speak. There were no words left to say. And so we remained, trapped in the darkness of the place where we should never have been. The once familiar creaks and groans of the building had settled, leaving behind an eerie stillness that felt almost like a waiting presence. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath, watching us with some force beyond our comprehension. There were no more whispers, no more distorted laughter, just the relentless pressure of the darkness closing in around us. We were trapped. I had no doubt of that anymore. The door wouldn't open, and there was nothing left for us to try. I could feel it in my bones, that sense of finality that came with knowing you were never getting out. The building had claimed us, and whether it was by force or by choice, we had become part of its cursed existence. Matt was silent beside me, his body rigid, his face pale and tight with terror. I could see him trembling, his eyes darting nervously as if waiting for something to appear from the shadows. I could feel the weight of his fear pressing against me. It was suffocating, and I hated the helplessness I felt. I hated the fact that we were both too afraid to even speak. What was there to say, really? We were standing at the edge of something we couldn't understand, trapped in a place that had no compassion, no mercy. And then, as if the silence had finally grown too loud, I heard a sound. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps echoing in the distance, coming from the far end of the hallway. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned toward Matt, but he had already heard it too. We both stood there, frozen, waiting for the next step, straining to hear where the footsteps would lead. But the steps didn't get any closer. Instead, they seemed to stop, as if the person, if it was even a person, was waiting, just as we were. I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise. Something wasn't right. There was no reason for anyone to be here, not after all the strange occurrences we had already witnessed. Whoever or whatever was in this building with us wasn't human. Not anymore. Matt shifted nervously beside me, breaking the silence. "What do we do?" His voice was barely a whisper, as if he was afraid that even speaking too loudly might provoke whatever was out there. But I didn't have an answer. My mind was spinning, 1,000 questions colliding with each other, all leading to one inevitable conclusion. There was no way out. There never had been. I glanced back down the hallway, my eyes struggling to make sense of the shadows. They seemed to shift and move, as if the very walls of the building were alive, growing and contracting with each passing second. My gaze lingered on a corner near the end of the hallway, where the darkness seemed to twist unnaturally. It was as if there was something waiting there, something with eyes that had been watching us since we first entered. The footsteps started again, but this time they were closer. I could hear the sound of boots scraping against the floor, the faintest hint of a heavy breath that seemed to fill the space between us. My heart raced as I turned to Matt, his eyes wide with panic. We both knew that whatever was coming down that hallway wasn't here to help. It wasn't here to save us. It was here for something much darker. We both took a step back, instinctively trying to distance ourselves from whatever was approaching. But the hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the distance between us and whatever was coming growing shorter with each second. I could feel my legs trembling, my mind screaming at me to move, to run, but there was nowhere to go. The door wouldn't open, and the walls were closing in around us. I could feel it, they were closing in. Then it appeared. It was nothing like I expected. The figure didn't step into the light as I thought it would. Instead, it emerged from the shadows, as though it had been there all along, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. It was tall, its outline sharp and angular, almost too sharp, as if it were made of the very darkness that surrounded us. Its face was obscured, hidden beneath a tattered cloak that seemed to absorb the dim light in the hallway, making it impossible to discern any details. I took a step back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "Who? What are you?" I choked out, my voice hoarse from fear. But the figure didn't answer. It just stood there, motionless, as if waiting for something. My mind screamed at me to run, to do something, but my body wouldn't obey. I couldn't move. The presence of the figure was overwhelming, its very being bending the air around it, suffocating the space. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. It didn't vanish into thin air. No, it simply moved. 1 second, it was standing at the end of the hallway, and the next, it was right in front of us, so close I could feel the coldness radiating off it, deep, unnatural chill that sent shivers down my spine. I froze. The thing didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough to paralyze me. I could feel its gaze, even though I couldn't see its eyes. It was as if it knew everything about me, my fears, my regrets, my every weakness. It had seen it all, and now it was here to claim me. Matt's hand shot out, grabbing my arm with a vice-like grip. His eyes were wide, pleading, as if begging me to do something. But there was nothing to be done. We were caught. There was no escape. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The hallway was empty again, silent and still. But it wasn't the silence of a safe place. It was the silence of something that had consumed all sound, all life, leaving only the remnants of what had been. Matt and I stood there for what felt like an eternity, our minds scrambling to make sense of what had just happened. Was it real? Had we imagined it? The question haunted me, gnawing at my every thought. But deep down, I knew the answer. The building had claimed us. It had claimed Tom, and it would never let us go. We left the building that night, if you can call it leaving. We stumbled out into the cool night air, both of us too shaken to speak. The world outside seemed foreign now, distant, as if we had stepped into a different reality altogether. But there was no real escape. We were still here, still haunted by the building, still haunted by what had happened. And though we may never understand what we encountered that night, one thing was clear. The abandoned amusement park was not just a place. It was something much darker. And it would continue to draw people in, pulling them into its twisted grip, one by one. It was a cool, crisp autumn morning when I set off for what was supposed to be a simple hike through the nearby forest. I've always enjoyed spending time outdoors, and I'd heard a lot of people talk about this trail, an old forest path, winding through the trees and stretching for miles. It wasn't a challenging route, not by any means, but there was something about it that pulled at me, something inviting yet mysterious. I'd been planning the hike for a while. The weather had been perfect for it. Not too hot, not too cold. It was one of those perfect days when the air smells fresh, the sun is bright, and the sky stretches endlessly in its blue calmness. Just the kind of day that begs you to get outside and explore. So I threw on my hiking boots, grabbed a backpack with some snacks and water, and left the house. As I walked to the car, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. The drive to the trailhead was peaceful, mostly empty roads lined with fields and farms, the sort of landscape you can get lost in, where time slows down and everything feels ordinary. As I parked my car by the trail entrance, I noticed how quiet everything was. Not a soul in sight, just the whisper of the wind through the trees. That was the first sign that the day might take a turn I wasn't expecting. I was used to hiking alone. It's my thing. I've always been the type to seek solitude in nature. The silence, the solitude, there's a sort of peace that comes from being surrounded by nothing but trees and the occasional bird call. I didn't mind being by myself. In fact, I preferred it. The trail itself was well marked, just a dirt path that twisted through towering trees. The kind of forest that's dense enough to feel remote, but not so thick that you can't see the light breaking through the branches. The sun filtered through the canopy, casting shadows on the ground and illuminating patches of wildflowers along the edge of the path. I walked along, breathing in the fresh air, my boots crunching against the fallen leaves, and I felt content. It had been a while since I'd gone on a hike like this, just me and the forest. The world felt far away, and I could feel the weight of everything lift from my shoulders. Work, responsibilities, the usual noise of daily life, it all seemed so distant as I walked deeper into the woods. Nothing seemed off, nothing out of the ordinary. It was just me, the trees, and the path ahead. I passed a few old twisted oaks with gnarled roots, their bark rough and weathered. There was something eerie about them, but not in a way that made me feel uncomfortable. It was more like they had been standing there for so long that they were just part of the landscape. They weren't threatening, but they were ancient, and there was something calming about their age. As I walked further, I started to notice a strange stillness. The usual sounds of the forest bird songs, rustling leaves, the occasional scurry of small animals began to fade. At first, I brushed it off as just the quiet of the woods, but the silence seemed to deepen, like the forest itself had taken a breath and held it. I stopped for a moment to take a sip of water and look around. The path was still well maintained, but I felt the weight of the silence pressing in. It was as if the forest was watching me. The thought was fleeting, but it made me uneasy, just for a moment. Shaking off the feeling, I continued on. The path twisted and turned, and I couldn't help but admire the way the sunlight danced on the forest floor, the golden light illuminating the dirt trail ahead of me. But as the minutes passed, something about the forest felt different. There was no more chatter from the birds, no buzzing of insects, just this deep, unsettling quiet that seemed to follow me as I moved along the path. It was around that point that I noticed the first odd thing. I was walking at a steady pace when I saw a shadow ahead of me, shifting between the trees. At first, I thought it was just the movement of the wind, causing the branches to sway. But the shadow moved too deliberately, too smoothly, like something or someone was walking along the trail in front of me. I stopped, my heart beating a little faster. I didn't hear footsteps, no crunching leaves, no sounds of anything in motion. But the shadow, it was there, moving between the trees, keeping pace with me. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to make of it. I thought about calling out, but then remembered how remote this trail was. It didn't make sense for someone else to be out here. I hadn't seen another hiker when I arrived, and the thought of encountering anyone so deep into the forest seemed strange. I took another step forward, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. But when I looked again, the shadow was gone. No sign of it at all. It was like it had never been there. I didn't know what to think. Maybe I had just imagined it. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or perhaps my mind was playing games on me after hours of solitude in the woods. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I kept walking, a little faster now, trying to convince myself that I was being paranoid. But with every step, the silence seemed to grow deeper, more profound. It was as if the world had fallen away, leaving only me and the endless trees. And then, without warning, I heard something. A sound that didn't belong. It was a low rustling, like something moving through the underbrush just off the path. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or some other creature, but the sound was too deliberate, too slow. And then I heard it again, closer this time, like something was following me, moving just out of sight. My heart raced and I gripped the straps of my backpack, trying to steady my breathing. I glanced over my shoulder, but all I saw were the trees stretching behind me, their dark trunks reaching into the sky. I took another step forward, my mind racing, but the noise didn't stop. It was still there, faint but undeniable. Something or someone was out there, keeping pace with me. And that was when the first real wave of unease hit me. As I continued walking, trying to calm myself, the unsettling noise persisted, growing slightly louder with each step I took. I couldn't pinpoint exactly where it was coming from. Was it to my left? My right? The sound of rustling leaves or a faint snap of a twig? It was subtle but undeniable. The kind of noise that makes you question what you know about the world around you. My pace quickened instinctively, my boots now pounding on the path in an attempt to drown out the anxiety creeping up my spine. It felt like the air had thickened, becoming dense and heavy with an unnatural stillness, as though everything in the forest was holding its breath. The birds that usually flitted through the trees, calling to one another, were silent now. The breeze that had been gently swaying the branches earlier had stopped completely. It was just me, and that strange sound, punctuating the silence like a warning. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon moving through the underbrush, curious but harmless. The forest was full of wildlife after all. I had been on hikes in remote areas before, and the creatures living there weren't shy. But the feeling of being watched, that I couldn't shake. I paused again, this time standing completely still, listening intently. For a moment, there was nothing. The silence was so complete, I could hear the faintest thrum of my own heartbeat. But then, just as I was about to resume walking, the rustling returned. This time, it was closer, much closer. I jerked my head around, eyes scanning the area behind me, my heart racing. Nothing. There was no movement in the trees, no figure stepping out onto the path. But the rustling didn't stop. It was like something was just beyond the tree line, out of sight, but somehow still there, following me. It wasn't just the noise now. I could feel it, the presence. Something was wrong. The rational part of my brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was the wind playing tricks on me, or the rustling of branches moving in a way I hadn't noticed before. But it didn't feel like that. It felt like something deliberate, something intentional. My pulse quickened, and I turned around, my eyes darting from tree to tree, searching for any sign of movement. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The trees, normally comforting and steady, now seemed like looming giants watching me, their dark branches reaching out like long fingers. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the feeling. The sun was still high in the sky, and the trail ahead was open and clear. There was no reason to feel this way. Still, I couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease gnawing in my insides. I'd been on plenty of solo hikes, and nothing like this had ever happened before. I'd walked many trails alone in forests that were far more remote than this one, and yet, this felt different. Maybe it was the isolation. Maybe I'd been alone too long, or maybe something wasn't quite right in this forest. I couldn't tell which, but the unsettling feeling lingered. I decided to keep going. I had come this far, I wasn't about to turn back because of some strange noises. Still, I couldn't shake the nagging sense that I wasn't alone. I looked behind me again, then quickly forward, almost expecting to see someone or something walking behind me. That's when I saw it. It wasn't a person, not exactly, but it was a figure. A shadow in the trees, standing unnaturally still, almost like it was waiting. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a long moment, I didn't move, didn't breathe. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out every other sound in the world. Was it a person? It didn't seem like one. It was just too still, too unnatural. I couldn't see any clear outline of a person, just a dark shape, hidden among the trunks of the trees. I blinked rapidly, trying to focus, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But before I could even process it fully, the figure was gone. Vanished without a trace, like smoke being blown away in the wind. I stood frozen on the spot, my pulse racing. Had I seen something? Had it been my mind playing tricks on me? No, that didn't feel right. That figure had been too real, too deliberate. It hadn't moved like any person or animal I'd ever seen. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to take a step forward. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. Maybe there was some logical explanation. I couldn't let myself get carried away by fear. But with every step, that gnawing feeling of being watched only grew stronger. The rustling, which had stopped for a moment, was back again, louder now and closer. It was impossible to ignore now. I turned, my eyes scanning the trees again. But this time, something was different. There, in the distance, just beyond the tree line, I could see movement. A shadow flickering between the trunks of the trees. It was unmistakable now. Someone or something was following me. I had to act. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. My instinct told me to keep moving, to leave the path and find a way out. But something inside me told me not to run. That would only make it worse. Instead, I turned around and called out, "Hello?" My voice felt weak and distant, swallowed up by the vastness of the forest. "Is someone there?" There was no answer, just the deep, unbroken silence of the woods. The rustling had stopped once more, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, waiting, watching. I didn't wait for a response. My heart was racing in my chest, and I couldn't shake the growing dread that had settled into my bones. It was a feeling I had never experienced on any of my hikes before, this sense that I wasn't just in a forest, but in a place that was alive, aware of my every move. I kept walking, my pace quickening again. My mind raced with questions. Was it just an animal? Had I imagined the figure? But deep down, I knew that what I had seen, what I had felt, was real. I wasn't alone in these woods, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out what or who was watching me. The air seemed to grow colder, the sunlight dimming as the trees closed in around me. My footsteps, now too loud in the silence, were the only sound I could hear. And through it all, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was just behind me, closing the distance with every step I took. And then, for a brief moment, I thought I heard something else. A voice, soft and distant, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. But when I turned around to look, there was nothing. The strange events I had experienced on that first day were far from isolated. In fact, as I pushed deeper into the forest, the sense of unease only intensified. Each step seemed to draw me further into the unknown, and I found myself questioning whether it was the isolation making my mind run wild, or if something more sinister was at play. At first, I tried to rationalize everything. The rustling in the trees? Probably just animals. The fleeting shadow? A trick of the light or my imagination. But as the days wore on, my skepticism began to erode, and the signs of something wrong grew harder to ignore. The forest, once so beautiful and peaceful, now felt suffocating. The deeper I ventured, the heavier the atmosphere became. It wasn't just the silence anymore, which was still unnerving, but the way everything around me seemed to feel too still, as if the forest itself was waiting, watching. Every branch seemed to be poised to snap at the slightest touch. Every fallen leaf crunched loudly underfoot, amplifying the already oppressive quiet. The moments of calm I had experienced in the beginning were now few and far between. The subtle sounds, the rustling leaves, the occasional snap of a twig, had turned into a constant backdrop, like an unseen presence lurking just behind me. I began to hear things that didn't make sense, sounds that didn't belong to the forest. Soft whispers, almost inaudible, would float through the trees, but when I stopped to listen, they would vanish as quickly as they had appeared. I tried to shake off the growing panic, but it clung to me like a shadow. I began noticing other things too. Small changes in the landscape, things I hadn't noticed before. The trees, for instance. Some of them seemed twisted, their bark knotted in unnatural patterns, as though the trees were trying to tell me something. The roots stretched out of the earth like long fingers, clawing at the dirt, as if they were trying to escape. There was one tree in particular, a massive oak that stood at the edge of the trail. I had passed it several times without thinking much of it, but now I couldn't help but feel drawn to it. Its gnarled branches stretched high into the sky, its bark weathered and cracked. But what unsettled me wasn't the tree itself. It was the strange symbols etched into the bark. They were faint, barely visible at first, but on closer inspection, I could see that they were no natural markings. They seemed deliberate, as if someone had carved them into the tree with great care. I traced my fingers over the symbols, trying to make sense of them. They looked ancient, almost otherworldly. But before I could give it any more thought, a sudden movement caught my eye. I spun around, heart pounding, expecting to see someone or something lurking just beyond the tree line. But there was nothing. It was then that I realized just how deep into the forest I had wandered. The trail I had been following had all but disappeared, swallowed up by the dense undergrowth. I had no clear sense of direction anymore. The towering trees all looked the same, and the trail had become a distant memory. Panic started to settle in. I had read about people getting lost in forests like this, disappearing without a trace. But this wasn't just any forest. Something was off. Something was wrong. I stopped for a moment, trying to calm myself. I pulled out my map, but it was useless. The landmarks were too vague, and the scale was all wrong. I couldn't even tell which way I had come from. I tucked the map back into my bag and decided to retrace my steps, hoping that I could find the trail again. But as I moved forward, I noticed something that stopped me cold. Footprints. Fresh ones. They were large and deep, clearly belonging to someone or something heavy. They led off the trail, disappearing into the thick underbrush. I knew, without a doubt, that these footprints weren't mine. I had been walking alone in this part of the forest for hours, and no one had passed by me. I crouched down, studying the tracks. They didn't look like human footprints. The shape was all wrong, the toe marks too rounded, almost animalistic. But they weren't animal tracks either. I couldn't identify them. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I realized how recent they were. Whoever or whatever had made them hadn't been gone long. My breath caught in my throat as I followed the trail, every nerve on edge. The further I went, the stranger the forest seemed to get. The trees closed in tighter, their trunks becoming twisted and gnarled, almost as if the forest itself was trying to obscure my path. The air felt thick, pressing down on me with every step. The whispers that had been haunting me earlier were louder now, not voices, but soft murmurs that seemed to come from all around me. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I could feel their presence, like something was right there, watching me. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement again. A figure, no, not a figure, but a shadow darted between the trees. I whipped my head around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. No movement, no sign of anyone or anything. I was alone. But I wasn't. The unsettling noises were getting louder, closer now. Footsteps, but not mine. Not the animal tracks. Something else was out there, moving silently just behind me, staying just out of sight. I didn't dare look back. I kept walking, faster now, my breath shallow, my legs trembling. Then came the first real sign that I wasn't alone. A soft thud, like something heavy dropping onto the ground behind me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I turned around, but there was nothing there. Just the dark, silent trees. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving in the distance, something following me. I didn't wait around to find out. I broke into a run, ignoring the branches that slapped at my face, the rough ground beneath my feet. The whispers had become more distinct, now louder, urgent. It was like they were trying to get my attention. I stumbled through the underbrush, desperate to find the trail again, but it was gone. The forest seemed to have shifted, like it was trying to trap me. The trees no longer felt familiar. The air grew colder, heavier, as if the very forest was alive and aware of me, and it didn't want me to leave. I couldn't take it any longer. I screamed into the empty woods, my voice cracking. "Who's there? What do you want from me?" But my words were swallowed by the forest, disappearing into the ever-present silence. I felt an overwhelming urge to leave, to escape the suffocating grip of the trees. But no matter how fast I ran, the forest seemed to close in around me, twisting, warping, pulling me deeper into its depths. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw something. A flicker of movement, not far ahead. Not an animal, not a shadow, but a figure. It was standing still, just barely visible through the trees. For a moment, I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat. Who or what was it? And then it moved. I didn't wait to see what it was. I didn't want to know. I turned and bolted through the trees, my legs burning, my heart hammering in my chest. But as I ran, one thought kept echoing through my mind. I wasn't just lost in the forest anymore. I was being hunted. I didn't know how long I'd been running. Time seemed to lose all meaning as I pushed through the thick underbrush, branches whipping at my face. Every step felt like it took me deeper into the heart of the forest, further from any hope of escape. The whispers had stopped, but the oppressive silence was worse, like the air had thickened, each breath harder to draw. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to turn around, to look, to see what was following me. But I wouldn't. I ran until my legs gave out, until my chest burned with the effort of each ragged breath. I stumbled, almost falling, before I collapsed to the ground, my hands trembling, palms pressed against the cool earth. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out the stillness around me. I tried to calm myself, to steady my breathing, but fear had taken root in me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in, that something was there just out of sight, just beyond my reach. As I lay there, trying to regain my composure, I thought I saw movement again, this time, closer. My breath hitched, and I turned, my pulse quickening. At first, I saw nothing but the thick shadows cast by the towering trees. But then, there it was. A figure. It wasn't human. Not exactly. The shape was wrong, twisted in a way that made my stomach turn. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that stretched too far and joints that bent in unnatural angles. Its face was obscured by the shadows, but I could see the glint of something eyes. No, not eyes, but something worse. A void, dark and empty, like looking into a bottomless pit. I couldn't look away, my body frozen in terror, unable to tear my gaze from whatever it was that stood there, watching me. I tried to move, to get up, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. It was as if they had turned to stone, my body paralyzed by an overwhelming sense of dread. And then, it stepped forward. The ground seemed to tremble with each movement, the forest around me groaning in response. I could hear the faint crackling of leaves, the slow, deliberate rustle of the creature's steps. Its presence was suffocating, the air growing thick and heavy with its nearness. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to get away, but I couldn't. I was trapped. The creature's gaze, or whatever that void was, shifted toward me, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. My head spun, my stomach churned, as though the very sight of it was pulling the life from me. I wanted to scream, to call out for help, but the words caught in my throat, strangled by the sheer horror of what I was seeing. And then, in an instant, the world seemed to shift. The forest around me changed. The trees that had once stood tall and proud now seemed twisted, their trunks bent at impossible angles, their branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal arms. The air was colder, heavier, and the whispers returned faint at first, but growing louder, growing more insistent. They filled my head, drowning out everything else, their meaning impossible to decipher, but their presence undeniable. I tried to stand again, my hands pressed against the dirt as I pushed myself up. My legs were weak, unsteady beneath me, but I couldn't stay down. I couldn't let that thing get any closer. But when I looked up again, it was gone. The figure had vanished, melted into the shadows as if it had never been there at all. My breath caught in my chest as I scanned the area, my heart still hammering in my chest. I could feel the blood rushing in my ears, the panic flooding my mind. Where had it gone? For a long moment, everything was silent. No rustling of leaves, no whispers, no movement at all. It was as if the forest had swallowed the creature whole. I didn't know whether to be relieved or more afraid. And then, a voice, soft, distant, but unmistakably real, sounded from behind me. "You're not supposed to be here." I froze. The voice wasn't human. It was low, guttural, distorted, like something trying to speak through a wall of static. It sent a jolt of terror through me, the kind that made my skin prickle and my breath catch in my throat. I whipped around, expecting to see something, anything, but the space around me remained empty, as if the voice had come from nowhere and everywhere at once. I took a step back, my foot scraping against the ground, and that's when I saw it, the ground itself. It wasn't solid anymore. The dirt beneath me was soft, spongy, like it was alive, breathing, shifting. I could feel the earth beneath my feet giving way, as if the very ground was moving, as if it was drawing me in, pulling me closer to whatever lay beneath. The voice spoke again, louder this time, clearer. "You shouldn't have come." And then I saw it. From the shadows emerged a shape, a figure, but this time it was different. It was human, or at least it looked human at first glance. But its skin was pale, almost translucent, its features distorted, stretched as though something had broken it. Its eyes, wide and hollow, were fixed on me, and when it opened its mouth, a horrid, raspy sound emerged, not a voice, but a cry, a scream. I staggered backward, my legs giving way, but there was no escape. The figure moved toward me, slowly at first, and then faster, as if it were closing the distance between us with terrifying speed. I wanted to scream, but my voice failed me. I couldn't make a sound. And then, in a blink, everything went dark. I don't know how long I was unconscious, or if I was even unconscious at all. Time had no meaning in the darkness, and when I opened my eyes again, I wasn't in the forest anymore. The trees were gone, replaced by a suffocating, oppressive blackness. I could feel it pressing against me, all around me, suffocating me. I tried to move, to get up, but my body refused to cooperate. I was trapped in the dark, and I could hear it, the whispering, the voices growing louder, closer. It was a sudden shift, a break in the suffocating void around me. It wasn't light, not exactly, but something different. It was like a crack had opened in the world, a faint, pulsating glow emerging from the edges of my vision. The whispering that had once filled my ears with dread quieted, replaced by a low hum, almost like a lullaby, soft and familiar, but it carried no comfort. I had no idea where I was, how I had gotten here, or if this place even existed at all. Everything around me felt like a dream, an illusion, but there was a pressing weight in the air, something tangible, something real. And then I heard a sound. A voice, distant and faint, but unmistakably human, speaking my name. It wasn't just the voice, though. It was the tone, something in it, a sense of urgency, as if it were trying to reach me through an insurmountable distance. "You have to move." It was as though the voice itself had power. It reverberated through the darkness, not just in my ears, but in my bones. The hairs on my neck stood on end, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I moved. I stumbled forward, my legs trembling beneath me. The ground beneath me seemed solid now, no longer soft and shifting. But with each step, the sensation of being pulled back toward the darkness began to fade. It was as though I was walking away from something of force, a presence that had held me captive. My mind raced, desperate for some kind of explanation, but there were no answers. The glow faint at first grew brighter with each step I took, and soon I could make out the shape of something ahead of me, a figure, standing still, unmoving. My heart skipped a beat, the terror threatening to take over once again, but I refused to stop. I couldn't. I was so close. As I approached, the figure became clearer. It wasn't the twisted, broken thing I had seen before. No, this was someone human. A man, perhaps. But there was something unsettling about him, something off. His features were obscured by the glow, his eyes hidden in shadow, his face pale. "You're almost free," he said, his voice barely a whisper, but it cut through the heavy silence like a blade. His words sent a chill through me, but I didn't stop. I pushed past the dread in my chest and took one final step toward him. And that's when I saw it, the thing that had been pulling me in, the force that had kept me trapped in that terrible, dark place. The ground beneath me was no longer solid. It was moving. Beneath the figure, beneath his feet, the earth was shifting, undulating like something alive, like the world itself was breathing. The glow had come from the depths of the earth, a strange, pulsating light that felt both ancient and unnatural. "You have to go," the figure said again, but this time his voice trembled. His eyes, if they could be called eyes, were wide, panicked, and for the first time I could see his face clearly. It was not the face of a man, but the face of something else. His skin was stretched thin, and his features were too sharp, too angular, like something had been pulled from his very soul. I felt a surge of panic. This wasn't someone trying to help me. This was someone who had been caught here too. A prisoner, just like me. And then, before I could react, the ground beneath him shifted violently, and he disappeared, vanished, sucked into the dark void below, swallowed up by the earth itself. I didn't wait. I couldn't. I turned and ran, my legs burning, my heart pounding in my chest as I raced through the darkness, following the flickering light that had begun to grow brighter and brighter. The air around me began to clear. The darkness that had once clung to my skin like a second layer of clothing started to recede. The earth underfoot solidified again, and the unsettling hum that had filled my mind slowly faded. I could hear the sounds of the forest now, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of birds, the wind in the trees. And then, suddenly, I was back. The forest path stretched out before me, the sunlight streaming through the canopy above. It was normal. Nothing like the twisted, nightmarish place I had just escaped from. But as I stood there, catching my breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. That something or someone was still there, watching, waiting. I didn't dare look back. It took me hours to find my way back to civilization. By the time I emerged from the woods, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the land. But the peace I had once felt in the forest was gone. A deep unease gnawed at me, a feeling that I couldn't shake, no matter how far I walked. I never told anyone what happened. How could I? Who would believe me? What would they think of me? But as I lay in bed that night, every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind outside made my skin crawl. It wasn't over. That was the worst part. I had escaped, but I knew I hadn't left it all behind. Because it wasn't the forest that haunted me. It was the dark things that lived inside it. 6. Ending. As the days passed, the weight of what happened in that forest began to feel like a distant memory, a nightmare that faded with the morning light. But every now and then, when I walk past the woods, I can't help but glance over my shoulder. I'll hear something, an almost imperceptible rustling, a whisper in the wind, and I'll stop, my heart racing, uncertain of whether or not it's my mind playing tricks on me. But I know the truth. The days bled into weeks, and I did my best to forget the nightmare that had unfolded in the woods. I told myself it was just a dream, a figment of my overactive imagination. After all, who would believe the truth? Who would understand that the very fabric of reality had been distorted in that cursed place? But there was a part of me that couldn't shake the fear, the lingering dread that still clung to me like the cold, oppressive air of the forest. I couldn't explain it. The pull, the suffocating presence that had nearly claimed me, the strange figure who had warned me and then disappeared. Nothing about it made sense, and yet it all felt too real to dismiss as a hallucination. Even as I tried to push it all away, the memory lingered like a shadow that refused to leave no matter how much I tried to step into the light. I tried to return to my normal life. I went back to work, kept up with my daily routine, surrounded myself with people who didn't know what I'd been through. It almost worked until I found myself walking near the edge of the forest again. I hadn't meant to go near it. I hadn't planned on returning to that place. But one afternoon, with the sun hanging low in the sky, I found my feet pulling me in that direction. It was as though something had drawn me, a silent beckoning that I couldn't ignore. I stood at the edge of the trees, looking into the dense woods, the leaves rustling softly in the breeze. I couldn't remember the last time I had been here, but it felt like a lifetime ago. It felt wrong, standing here again, as though the forest itself was watching, waiting for me. But the strangest part was that the forest seemed quieter, calmer, as if it had gone back to its peaceful, natural state, the one I had known before. A breeze stirred, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I glanced around, half expecting to see something or someone emerging from the shadows. But there was nothing. No strange figure. No glowing lights. Just the forest, as it had been before. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Something just beneath the surface of this peaceful scene, a presence I couldn't quite put my finger on. My heart began to race, and I took a step back, the familiar weight of fear settling in once more. But then I heard it. A faint noise, coming from deeper within the woods. At first, I thought it was just an animal, a rustling in the underbrush. But the sound grew louder, closer. It was a voice, a whisper, but not just any whisper. It was the same voice I had heard before, the one that had called my name in the dark, urging me to move. You shouldn't have come back. I froze, my blood running cold. The words seemed to echo around me, their meaning sinking deep into my mind. I didn't want to turn around, didn't want to look into the darkness again, but I couldn't resist. Slowly, I turned, my eyes scanning the woods for any sign of movement. At first, I saw nothing, just the shifting shadows of the trees, the soft rustling of the wind through the leaves. But then there, in the distance, I saw a figure, standing in the exact same spot I had seen before, illuminated by the faintest glow. The man, or at least, the thing that had once appeared as a man. His face was just as distorted as it had been before, and though I could no longer hear his voice, I could sense his presence. His eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to pierce into me from afar, and my stomach twisted in fear. I knew, deep down, that he wasn't just a figment of my imagination. He wasn't a dream, nor was he just some trick of the mind. He was something else, something dark, something ancient that had been lying in wait, bound to the very heart of the forest. With every passing second, the feeling in my chest grew heavier, and I could feel my legs growing weaker beneath me. I had to leave. I couldn't stay here. I had to get away from this place, from him. But as I turned to flee, my foot caught on something, and I fell hard to the ground, pain shooting through my body. I cursed under my breath, scrambling to get back on my feet, but something stopped me. A sudden, undeniable presence washed over me, and I froze in terror. The whispering started again. "You can't escape," it said, its voice now sharper, more insistent. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The fear was overwhelming, suffocating. I ran, faster than I had ever run before, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath ragged. I didn't care where I was going. All I cared about was putting as much distance between myself and that cursed place as possible. The trees seemed to close in around me, the darkness swallowing up the light. Every step I took felt like I was being pulled backward, deeper into the forest. My legs ached, but I didn't dare slow down. I kept running, my mind screaming at me to get out. And then, finally, the trees began to thin. I saw a glimpse of open sky, the faint light of the setting sun shining through the branches. I stumbled forward, desperate, and broke through the last of the trees. I was out. I had made it. But as I turned back to look at the forest, I saw something that made my blood run cold. At the very edge of the woods, standing just beyond the line of trees, I saw the figure again, his hollow eyes staring at me. He was waiting. I didn't stick around to find out what he wanted. I turned and ran faster than I had ever run in my life, never looking back. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following me. That something had followed me out of the woods. And now, as I sit here and write this, I know the truth. The forest may be behind me, but its presence, its darkness, is never far away. I don't know what that place was. I don't know what was in the woods or why it chose me. But one thing is certain. The forest is always watching, and it's not done with me yet. I can feel it, lurking in the corners of my mind. I can hear it, calling to me in the dead of night. I had just moved to the city for a new job, and with everything on my plate, I was eager to find a place that could offer me the peace and solitude I needed. The apartment was in a quiet neighborhood, away from the chaos of downtown, but still close enough to make my daily commute a breeze. The building was old, but not dilapidated. In fact, it seemed almost perfect, offering a rare charm that many modern apartments lacked. The hardwood floors, the high ceilings, the large windows, all of it was inviting. But something about it, even in that first moment, seemed just slightly off. I couldn't put my finger on it at the time, but that nagging feeling would never go away. The apartment itself was small, but that was all I needed. It had one bedroom, a cozy living area, and a tiny kitchen. A little cluttered, yes, but I loved it. It felt homey, like a place where I could unwind after a long day. I spent the first few days unpacking my things, getting settled in. My life had just shifted, and I was trying to adjust. Everything was routine work during the day, relaxing at night. For the first week, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I went to bed early, slept soundly, and woke up refreshed. But that sense of normalcy wouldn't last. The first time I met my neighbor, I was carrying a box of books down the hallway when she stepped out of her door. She was an older woman, probably in her late 60s, with silver gray hair and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. We exchanged pleasantries, and she told me her name was Joan. She was friendly, but there was something strange about her. She seemed distant, as though her thoughts were always somewhere else. At first, I dismissed it. After all, she was just a neighbor. Nothing more to think about. As the days passed, I began to notice more about the building. The creaks and groans of the old wood, the drafty windows that never seemed to seal properly, and the strange echoing noises that echoed through the walls at night. Nothing I couldn't ignore. After all, this was an old building, and these things were to be expected, right? But one night, just as I was beginning to settle into bed, I heard something different. A soft scratching noise, like nails dragging across the floor, came from somewhere outside my bedroom door. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe a rodent in the walls. I brushed it off. But then it happened again and again. Every night, like clockwork, I would hear the sound of scratching. It was faint at first, but gradually it grew louder. I couldn't understand it. It made my skin crawl. The apartment was supposed to be a safe haven, a place where I could find comfort and peace after a busy day. But slowly, this sense of unease began to creep in, gnawing at me from the inside. I started losing sleep. The scratching sounds, combined with the eerie silence of the building at night, made it hard to feel at ease. It was like the walls were closing in, and no matter what I did, I couldn't escape the unsettling feeling that something wasn't right. One evening, I decided to try to get to the bottom of it. I was sitting in the living room, scrolling through my phone, when I heard the scratching again. But this time, it was different. There was a faint whisper so soft that I almost convinced myself it was my imagination. But then, I heard it again. A voice, barely audible, calling out my name. It was as if the walls themselves were speaking to me. I froze. The sound of the voice, even though it was faint, made my heart race. I slowly stood up, my body trembling, and walked towards the door. My mind raced with questions. Was someone else in the building? Or was it something more? I reached for the door handle, my breath shallow, and as I opened the door just a crack, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. But there was nothing there. No one. The hallway was empty, just as it always had been. I closed the door, locking it behind me, but the feeling of unease lingered. I couldn't explain it, but something was off in that apartment. Something that was beyond what my eyes could see, something I couldn't yet understand. And as I lay back down, the scratching and whispering continued. It was only the beginning. The following week, the strangest event occurred. By this point, I had grown used to the faint scratching sounds, which had become an eerie nightly routine. But what happened one morning would set off a chain of events that would make it impossible for me to ignore any longer. It was a Saturday, and I had just returned from grocery shopping, the bags in my arms weighing heavily after a long day. I was looking forward to a quiet evening of cooking and perhaps catching up on a few shows. The rest of the world seemed to be going on as usual, completely unaware of the unease that had begun to plague me. As I entered the apartment, I immediately noticed something off. It wasn't the usual creaks or sounds from the walls, but something far more unsettling. The air felt thick, like something was pressing down on me. The faint scent of something sour lingered in the apartment, and I could have sworn it wasn't there when I left. I stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure of what I was sensing, but when my eyes fell on the hallway mirror across the room, I froze. The mirror, which had been cleaned just hours before, now had a large, smudged handprint on it. At first, I thought it could have been the result of me absent-mindedly touching the mirror while moving things around, but when I walked closer, the print seemed wrong. The shape was too large and too distinct, as though someone had pressed their hand against the glass. But the odd part was that the handprint was completely wet, leaving droplets of moisture along the edges, as if someone had left it moments before I came home. I quickly scanned the apartment, my heart rate increasing. There was no one else here. I was the only one who had a key to the place. My neighbor Joan, the only other person who lived in the building, hadn't been around when I arrived. But the print on the mirror, it couldn't have been me. It didn't make any sense. I wiped it off, my hands shaking as I tried to convince myself that it was just a strange coincidence. Maybe I had touched it without realizing, or perhaps there was something wrong with the mirror. It wasn't like I was the world's best housekeeper, and maybe I hadn't noticed a print forming earlier. I tried to reason with myself, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The rest of the day passed quietly enough, though the feeling of being watched never quite left me. Every time I went near the hallway mirror, I felt a chill run down my spine, as if the very glass held someone watching me. I tried to distract myself, cooking a simple meal and sitting down to watch a movie. But as the sun set and the light in the apartment dimmed, the unease that had settled over me returned, and I knew that it wasn't just my imagination. The next night, I decided to take a different route. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when I knew in my gut that something wasn't. I stayed up later than usual, hoping to catch whatever was causing these strange occurrences. The scratching noise returned, as did the whispers. They were soft at first, just like before, but this time the voice was clearer, more deliberate. It was my name, calling out in a sing-song manner. "Come here." The voice beckoned, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I rushed to the door and flung it open, hoping to see something, anything that could explain what was happening. The hallway was empty. There was nothing. No one. The voice stopped the moment I opened the door, and the only sound that filled the space was my heavy breathing. I stepped out into the hallway, cautiously, glancing in both directions. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" My voice echoed down the hall, but there was no answer, just the eerie silence. It was at that moment that I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, the light from the hallway lamp flickered briefly before going out entirely. The space was plunged into darkness. I felt a wave of dread flood over me, and for the first time, I wondered if I should leave, if I should run and never look back. But something kept me there. Something inside me refused to let go of the feeling that I could somehow find an explanation for this. I stood frozen in the darkened hallway, my mind racing. Was it a power outage? The building wasn't exactly modern, and old wiring could easily be to blame. But no matter how I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the unease that was now consuming me. The flickering light had not been an accident. It felt like it was trying to tell me something, or worse, it felt as if something had just made itself known to me in a way I couldn't ignore. I backed away from the hallway, retreating into the safety of my apartment, and I locked the door behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed wide awake, the silence pressing down on me. The shadows of the apartment danced around me, and the walls seemed to close in tighter and tighter, each creak of the floorboard sending a chill through my spine. It wasn't just the noises anymore. It wasn't just the whispering or the flickering lights. It was the feeling that there was something there, something in the apartment with me, a presence. Something that watched me when I wasn't paying attention. Something that made its mark on the mirror and left that feeling of unease behind it. And as the night wore on, I could no longer pretend that it was all just in my head. The next morning, I decided to speak to Joan. I needed to know if anyone else had experienced anything unusual in the building. Maybe I wasn't the only one going through this, and maybe she had some answers. So, after a quick breakfast, I walked down the hall and knocked on her door. When she answered, her face was pale, and she looked distracted. Her eyes avoided mine as she motioned for me to come in. I stepped inside her apartment, which was small but cozy. It smelled faintly of lavender and something else I couldn't quite place. It was a stark contrast to the heavy air in my apartment, but the oddness of the situation made my nerves more pronounced. "Have you noticed anything strange?" I asked cautiously. "Anything unusual happening in the building?" She paused, staring at me with wide eyes, and I couldn't tell if she was trying to process what I had said or if she was hiding something. "Unusual?" she finally said, her voice low and shaky. It's been quiet for me. Too quiet. Maybe it's the building. But you should be careful." Her eyes darted to the door, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in her face. "Careful?" I asked, my heart pounding. "What do you mean? What's happening here?" Joan didn't answer right away. She glanced around her apartment nervously before speaking in a soft whisper. "I'm not the only one who lives here." She paused again, and I felt my stomach drop. "There's something else, something that doesn't belong." The moment she said that, I realized the truth. Whatever was happening in my apartment wasn't just a coincidence. Something had been lurking in those walls, and it was only just beginning to make itself known. In the days that followed, the odd occurrences in the apartment grew more frequent and, to my horror, more intense. I had barely recovered from the shock of Joan's cryptic warning when the strange events began to pile on top of each other, one after another. What had been subtle and easy to dismiss as coincidences in the beginning now felt like an assault on my sanity. It started with the lights. The flickering in the hallway grew worse, spreading throughout the apartment, from the kitchen to the living room. At first, it was only the occasional dimming of the lights, a brief flash of darkness before they came back on. But then the light fixtures themselves began to malfunction. One by one, they would buzz, flicker violently, and then blink out entirely, only to come back on moments later, sometimes casting a sickly green way over the room. I had tried to fix it myself, replacing the bulbs, checking the wiring, but nothing worked. The electrical problems persisted, growing more erratic. I began to feel the weight of the silence around me more acutely. It wasn't a peaceful quiet anymore. It was thick, suffocating. Every sound, no matter how small, seemed amplified. The creaking of the floorboards, the soft rustling of fabric, even the wind pressing against the windows, everything felt too loud, too close. And then there was the air. It became colder, not just in the late evening when the temperature dropped, but in the middle of the day when the sun should have been warm. The chill felt unnatural, like something was drawing the warmth from the room, leaving only a biting cold behind. I kept my jacket on even while cooking, despite the apartment being heated. It wasn't just the physical sensations that became unsettling. The strange, whispering voice from the first night was now back, louder, more persistent. I could hear it in the hallway, in the kitchen, and even in my bedroom. It wasn't a murmur anymore. It was as if someone was standing right next to me, speaking softly but clearly, urging me to come closer. Every time I moved to investigate, the sound would fade, only to return moments later, picking up where it left off. The worst part was that it wasn't just a voice. Sometimes I could hear the faint sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate steps creeping toward me from the dark corners of the apartment. I'd spin around, but there was never anyone there. By now, I had started to question my own sanity. Was it all in my head? Was I just imagining things out of stress, or was there truly something dark pressing in on me from all sides? I couldn't tell anymore. But one thing became certain: there was no way I could continue living in this apartment without getting to the bottom of whatever was happening. I began to search the apartment more thoroughly, determined to find some sort of explanation. I started in the hallway, inspecting the mirror again, but it was clean, just like it had been before. I moved on to the living room, checking behind the furniture, looking for any hidden wires, any signs that could explain the strange occurrences. I even tried to talk myself out of it, telling myself that the building was old and full of quirks. But deep down, I knew better. I remember the moment I decided to check the basement. Joan's warning had been on my mind, and the thought of something hidden beneath the apartment nagged at me. The basement was a strange place, dimly lit, with the smell of damp concrete and old wood that seemed to have been left untouched for decades. I'd never been down there before. The door to the basement was always locked, and I had no reason to go down there. Until now. With my heart pounding in my chest, I retrieved the old key from the kitchen drawer and made my way to the basement door. The metal was cold to the touch, and the key turned with a loud, echoing click. As I opened the door, the musty smell hit me full force, and the dim light from above barely illuminated the first few steps of the staircase leading down. I hesitated for a moment, but then stepped forward, my breath shallow. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended. The further I went, the more the air seemed to grow heavier, like a suffocating weight pressing down on me. The small light above flickered intermittently, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. My footsteps echoed through the empty space, adding to the growing sense of dread. When I finally reached the bottom, I was greeted by a vast, open room, its walls lined with old boxes and forgotten furniture, remnants of a past long gone. But in the far corner, my eyes fell on something that stopped me dead in my tracks. There was a door, small, barely noticeable, tucked behind a stack of crates. It was different from the others. This one had a strange symbol carved into the wood, something I couldn't quite make out in the dim light. It looked old, as if it had been there for years, hidden away. I approached it cautiously, my hands trembling. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I couldn't help myself. Something drew me to that door. I reached out and touched the handle. It was ice cold, sending a jolt through my fingers. Slowly, I turned the knob, and to my surprise, the door creaked open with ease. On the other side was darkness, an overwhelming, inky blackness that seemed to swallow the light from above. I stepped inside, my heart racing, and the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me in the dark. It was then that I heard it again, the whisper. This time, though, it wasn't just a voice. It was something else, something deeper, more guttural. A low growl, mixed with the faintest sound of a child's laughter. I couldn't make sense of it, but it was there, just behind my ear. I turned quickly, expecting to see something, anything, but there was nothing. Just the overwhelming darkness pressing in on me, closing tighter with every passing second. In a panic, I stumbled backward, my hands brushing against the cold stone walls of what I now realized was some kind of cellar, forgotten and abandoned long ago. As I fumbled for the door, I caught sight of something on the floor, a pattern, a shape that had been etched into the stone. It was a circle, surrounded by strange, almost indecipherable symbols. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just an old, abandoned space. It was something more, something deliberate. Someone had come here before me. Someone had used this place for something dark. But who? And what were they trying to summon? I turned and ran, throwing open the door to escape the suffocating darkness, the whispers still echoing in my mind. The moment I stepped back into the light of the basement stairs, I slammed the door shut behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. I had no answers, only more questions, and the feeling that whatever I had just uncovered was only the beginning. Something was coming for me. Something was already here, and it would not rest until it had me. The events that followed my discovery in the basement happened so quickly that I barely had time to process them. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, something lurking just beyond my reach. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the dark symbols in the cellar, the cold, suffocating air that had wrapped around me when I entered. The whispers still echoed in my mind, and the more I tried to ignore them, the louder they became. By now, I knew I couldn't just ignore this any longer. I had to confront whatever was haunting me. It all came to a head the following evening. I had returned home, determined to face my fears. I couldn't keep living in this constant state of dread. I had decided that I would find out everything about the apartment, everything about the strange forces at work. I was done running. But even as I stepped through the door of the apartment, I felt the atmosphere change. The air felt heavier, like it was thick with an unseen presence. It was as if the apartment itself had changed, become something different. It didn't feel like the same place I had moved into just weeks ago. It was darker now, oppressive and suffocating. I tried to stay calm as I walked through the apartment, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to twitch, and the floorboards groaned beneath my feet, as if they were alive and reacting to my every move. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, like eyes were burning into the back of my skull. I couldn't escape it. I sat down on the couch, trying to calm my racing thoughts, but then I heard it again, the whisper. Only this time, it wasn't soft or distant. It was loud, clear, and coming from the other side of the room. It called my name, a voice deep and distorted, as though it had been dragged from the darkest corners of the earth. I turned around, my pulse quickening, but the room was empty. No one was there. My heart hammered in my chest. The shadows in the corner shifted again, and this time I saw something, a figure, indistinct at first, standing just beyond the edge of the room. It was tall, too tall, and it moved in a way that wasn't natural, as if it was both floating and walking at the same time. Its presence was like a crushing weight, pulling the air out of the room, making it hard to breathe. I froze, my entire body locking up in fear. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. Then, without warning, the figure stepped forward, emerging from the shadows. Its face was a grotesque blur, as if it couldn't decide on one shape. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were hollow, black voids that seemed to pull everything into them. I could feel myself being drawn into those pits of nothingness, and the overwhelming urge to look away was impossible to resist. The figure reached out toward me, its hand long and bony, the fingers stretching unnaturally far. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat tightened, and I gasped for air as the thing drew closer, its cold, icy breath sweeping over me like a storm. The chill was unbearable, freezing me in place, paralyzing me with terror. I wanted to run, to flee, but I couldn't move. I was stuck, trapped in my own apartment, with something that I couldn't understand and couldn't escape. The figure loomed above me, its presence filling the room like a storm cloud ready to burst. I could feel its hatred, its malice. It was as if this thing existed solely to torment me, to make me feel its wrath. It leaned in close, and in that moment, I could hear its voice, not the whisper from before, but something darker, more sinister. It spoke in a language I didn't recognize, the words crawling over my skin like ice. But even though I didn't understand the words, I understood the meaning behind them, an ancient curse, a binding that tied me to this place, this nightmare. As the figure's hand reached for my throat, I felt an overwhelming surge of fear. It wasn't just physical fear, it was a terror that gripped my soul, a fear that seemed to come from deep within me, from something I couldn't even comprehend. I was no longer in control of my body, my mind. It was as if the fear itself had taken over, overriding everything else. And then, just as the cold fingers brushed against my skin, the room seemed to shift. The walls closed in around me, the floor cracked open, and the room was no longer the apartment I had known. It was dark, endless, filled with shadows that seemed to stretch on forever. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the whispers that had once been distant now filled my ears, a cacophony of voices that spoke in unison, chanting something I couldn't understand. The figure was gone, but its presence lingered, a lingering weight in the air. I looked around in panic, trying to find a way out, but there was no exit. No door, no windows. Just an endless void, stretching into nothingness. The whispers continued, louder now, more frantic. They spoke of things long forgotten, of ancient rituals and dark power, of things that should never be disturbed. And then, in the midst of the chaos, I heard a familiar sound, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. I turned, my heart racing, and there, in the distance, I saw a figure standing in the darkness. But this time, it wasn't the creature that had haunted me before. It was something else, something more familiar. It was Joan. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. She reached out to me, her mouth moving, but no sound came out. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I could see the terror in them, the same terror I had felt earlier, the same terror that was now consuming me. She reached out, her hand trembling, but before I could move toward her, the shadows closed in again, and everything went black. I awoke with a jolt, gasping for air, my body drenched in sweat. The room was back to normal, empty, quiet, and still. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. Whatever had just happened, whatever I had just seen, was only the beginning. The figure, the whispers, the shadows, they were all real, and they weren't going to stop until they had me. I tried to steady my breathing, to convince myself it was just a nightmare, but the terror in my chest wouldn't subside. I wasn't safe, not anymore. The thing in the apartment, whatever it was, had made its move, and there was no way I was going to escape it. I couldn't stay in that apartment any longer. The feeling of being trapped, of something watching me from the shadows, was too much to bear. After the encounter with the figure and the terrifying visions, I knew that if I didn't leave, I wouldn't survive. I had to get out. I could feel the weight of whatever was haunting me pressing down on me, and with each passing moment, it became more difficult to breathe, to think clearly. It was as if the apartment itself was closing in on me, slowly tightening its grip. I packed up what little I had left, hardly taking the time to even think about the possessions I was leaving behind. I couldn't afford to waste any more time. My heart pounded in my chest as I moved quickly, throwing clothes and personal items into a bag. Every creak of the floorboard, every gust of winds outside seemed to echo with the threat of something unseen. I could feel the whispers coming again, faint but unmistakable, and the shadows at the corners of the room seemed to stretch and shift with a life of their own. I took one last look around the apartment, half expecting to see the dark figure standing there, waiting for me. But there was nothing. The apartment seemed strangely calm, almost too calm, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for me to make my move. I hesitated, but only for a moment. The fear of what was lurking in those walls, the constant unease that had followed me for so long, was more than enough to push me out the door. As I stepped out into the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every step I took felt heavier, like I was dragging something behind me, something that wouldn't let go. I could hear footsteps echoing in the distance, but when I turned, no one was there. The silence of the building was deafening, and yet it felt as though something was waiting, watching me from the shadows. My pace quickened as I reached the stairs, but with every turn, I felt the presence behind me grow stronger. When I finally reached the front door of the building, I could feel my chest tightening, the weight of the fear pressing down on me again. I was so close to escaping, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn back in. The apartment had become a part of me, and no matter how far I ran, I wasn't sure it would ever let me go. But I pushed those thoughts aside. I had to leave. I had to. I stepped out into the cool night air, the crisp wind hitting my face like a slap. The world outside felt so normal, so alive. It was as though I had been living in a different reality for the past few weeks. But even as I stood there, taking in the sounds of the city, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something had followed me. Something was still in my mind, in my soul, and it wouldn't let go. I called Joan, knowing I needed to speak to her. She hadn't returned to the apartment after that night, the night we had both felt the overwhelming presence, the night that had changed everything. My hands shook as I dialed her number, and I couldn't help but wonder if she had felt the same terror, the same suffocating dread that I had. She answered on the second ring. "Hello?" Her voice was soft, almost too calm. There was a strange distance in her words, like she was far away, even though I knew she was only on the other end of the line. "Joan," I said, my voice hoarse. I'm out. I'm safe, but I don't know what's going on. I don't know what to do anymore." I heard her take a breath on the other end of the line. "I know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I felt it too. Something's not right. I couldn't stay there. It's like it's never going to end. I felt a shiver run down my spine. "What do you mean? What happened?" "I don't know," Joan replied. "It's like the apartment is alive, like it has a hold on us. I left, but it's still there. It's still with me. The whispers, the shadows, they won't go away." A chill settled in my chest. I wasn't the only one feeling it. Joan was still haunted by whatever presence had taken hold of the apartment. I thought, briefly, about going back to help her, to try and figure out what was happening. But deep down, I knew it was too dangerous. The apartment had already taken so much from us, our peace, our sanity, and I wasn't sure either of us would survive if we went back. "I don't know what's happening, Joan," I said quietly, "but we have to figure it out. We can't let this thing win." "I don't know if we can," she whispered. "I don't think it's something we can fight. It's like it's part of us now. It's always going to be there, even if we leave." The conversation ended in silence, a quiet understanding hanging in the air between us. I didn't know what was going to happen next. Would the thing in the apartment follow us wherever we went? Would it haunt us for the rest of our lives? Or would it fade like some terrible nightmare as soon as we were far enough away? I couldn't answer those questions. I didn't know what the future held, and I didn't have the answers. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in that apartment anymore. I had to get as far away from it as possible. I couldn't face it again. Over the next few weeks, I moved into a small, quiet apartment on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it was a place to call my own, far from the shadows that had once loomed over me. I thought I could leave the past behind me, start fresh, but the nightmares didn't stop. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the dark figure, the whispers echoing in my ears. The presence, that heavy, suffocating feeling, was never far from me. I had escaped the apartment, but I hadn't escaped the fear. I stayed in that apartment, living my life in a state of constant unease. And though I tried to move on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every corner, every shadow, every sound in the night sent me into a panic. I could feel it watching, waiting, lurking just out of sight. The nightmare wasn't over. It wasn't over for me, and it wasn't over for Joan either. I don't know what it was that haunted that apartment. Whether it was a spirit, a curse, or something else entirely, I'll never know. All I know is that it left its mark on me. And no matter how far I ran, I couldn't outrun it. The apartment was gone, but the fear would never truly leave me. It had followed me home, and there was no escape. It was a cold Tuesday evening when I found myself walking into the dimly lit building of the old factory. The kind of place that's been around for decades, tucked away on the outskirts of town. The one where the machinery hums and clatters all day, only to fall eerily silent at night. I had taken a new job that recently night shift work. The pay was decent and the hours weren't bad, but there was something about the place that felt off. I wasn't the only one who felt that way. I had heard other workers talk about the strange things that happened after hours, but it all seemed like exaggeration, the kind of tall tales you tell when you're trying to pass the time. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the place wasn't right. But, like most people, I needed the job, and I wasn't going to let a few weird stories get in the way of that. The building itself was massive. A factory with old brick walls, broken windows, and ceilings that groaned under the weight of years of use. The floors were smooth but creaky in places, with faint echoes of footsteps following you wherever you went. There was a musty smell in the air, like something long forgotten. At night, the shadows stretched across the factory floor, casting strange, shifting shapes against the walls. The faint glow of the streetlights outside did little to brighten the gloom inside, and the only real source of light came from the large fluorescent bulbs overhead that flickered occasionally. I wasn't alone in the factory, of course. There were other workers on the same shift, 3 or 4 of us at a time, depending on the day. But most of them kept to themselves, working silently, occasionally sharing a few words when the work required it. I had quickly learned to keep my head down and focus on the job, just like the rest of them. It was a simple job. My task was to monitor the machinery that ran throughout the night. A few large presses, conveyor belts, and mixers that needed to be kept running smoothly. I would spend hours sitting in the control room, eyes on the screens, occasionally getting up to check the machines and make sure nothing had jammed or malfunctioned. The job was repetitive, but it paid the bills. One of the other night shift workers, a guy named Theo, had been working there for years. He was quiet, older, and seemed a little worn from the long hours. He would often sit in the corner of the break room, sipping coffee, eyes glazed over like he was lost in thought. I remember the first time I asked him about the place. "Don't mind the factory," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "It's just a job." But you'll get used to the strange things. They're always here, lurking. His words were a little unsettling, but I figured it was just him being paranoid. Another person I worked with was Mia. She was younger, maybe in her early 20s, and seemed to have a more positive outlook on things. She would often tell stories about the day shift, how everything was normal and bustling, how the factory was alive with activity. She tried to make light of the fact that once the sun went down, everything changed. She joked that we were the brave ones for taking on the night shift. But there was always something in her eyes, a subtle hint of unease when she spoke about the night. Most nights, the work was uneventful. The machines hummed along, the lights buzzed overhead, and the hours dragged on. But there were other nights when the building seemed to come alive with sounds that didn't belong. At first, it was small things. A clang from somewhere in the back. A faint scratching sound that echoed through the hallways. Nothing that seemed to make sense, but enough to make you stop and listen. And it always happened when no one else was around. Over time, I started to notice it too. When the work slowed down and the factory was quiet, the strange noises would start. It was as if the building itself was breathing, shifting in the dark. There were nights when I'd stand by the machinery, just waiting for the next odd sound to come, waiting for the moment that would send my heart racing. It became harder to shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I tried to talk about it with Theo once, but he just shook his head, muttering under his breath. I told you, it's just the building. Don't let it get to you. But there was something in his voice, a nervous edge, that told me even he wasn't entirely comfortable with it. Mia, on the other hand, tried to ignore the oddities. She'd smile and joke, keeping the mood light whenever the silence was broken by strange noises. But even she would glance over her shoulder from time to time, as if checking for something or someone that wasn't there. It was as if the weight of the building's presence had seeped into all of us, just a little. And that's when the first unsettling thing happened. One night, I was working alone in the control room. The place was as quiet as ever, save for the occasional hum of the machinery in the distance. I was checking over the logs when I heard a soft tap, tap, tap. At first, I thought it was just the usual creak of the building settling, but then it came again, this time louder. Tap, tap, tap. I froze. It wasn't the sound of a creaking floorboard or a shift in the building. This was deliberate. Someone or something was knocking. I looked around the room. The walls were bare, the window too high up for anyone to be outside. There was no one else in the building that night. Or at least, that's what I thought. I hesitated, my breath catching in my chest. I stood up, slowly walking toward the door. My hand hovered over the doorknob, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. The knock came again. Tap, tap, tap. But this time, there was something different about it. It sounded closer. I opened the door and peered into the dark hallway. There was nothing there. Just the empty stretch of concrete floors and faded walls. My heart was racing, but I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. The building was old. Of course, it would make strange noises. I stepped back inside, locking the door behind me. I wasn't sure what had just happened, but I knew one thing. Something had just changed. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if the walls were closing in around me. It was the first time I truly felt it, the presence of something else in the building, something that didn't belong. The night after I first heard the knocking sound, I found myself struggling to push it from my mind. It was as if my thoughts kept circling back to the event, replaying the moment over and over in my head. Each time, I tried to convince myself that it had just been a trick of the mind, a creak, a gust of wind, nothing more. But the doubt lingered, gnawing at me, until I could no longer ignore it. I had entered the factory at the usual hour. The halls were dark, but the machines hummed steadily in the background, their mechanical rhythm offering a strange sense of comfort. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me feel grounded. The factory was large, and I could hear the distant sound of the others working on the opposite end of the building. I had always liked it that way, the solitude, It gave me a chance to focus, to get the work done without distractions. Theo and Mia had already started their shifts by the time I arrived. They were a few rooms over, working on the maintenance schedules and checking some of the older machines. As usual, we didn't interact much. We were all on our own during the long stretches of time between the machine checks. I was stationed at my usual post, seated in front of the control panel in the small, dimly lit room. The faint glow from the monitors illuminated the space, casting long shadows that flickered with the changing data. The sound of my fingers on the keyboard was the only noise besides the occasional beat from the machines. That's when it happened again. It started as a faint shuffling noise. I paused, my hands hovering over the keyboard as I strained to hear it. It was subtle at first, like someone walking across the floor in soft shoes, but there was no one else in the room with me. I glanced over my shoulder. The space behind me was empty, the door to the hallway slightly ajar, but still nothing. I turned my attention back to the machines, but the noise persisted. It wasn't the sound of a worker, nor the usual creaks of an old building settling. This was something different, something deliberate. I stood up, cautiously approaching the door. My heart rate quickened. There it was again, a soft shuffle, closer this time. I opened the door slowly, peering into the darkened hallway. The factory's silence felt suffocating. No one was there. Not a soul. I stepped back inside, my breath shallow. I wasn't sure if it was the lack of sleep or the strange events of the past few nights, but my mind was racing. I knew what I had heard, and yet there was no logical explanation. The rest of the building was just as quiet as I had left it. I forced myself to sit back down, determined to finish my shift without giving in to the creeping unease that was starting to settle in my chest. But that was when I noticed something strange. One of the machines, an older press near the back of the factory, had stopped. I hadn't seen it malfunction before, but it had gone completely still. I pulled up the monitor to check its status. There were no error messages, no warnings, yet the press sat motionless. I sighed, thinking maybe it was just a fluke. I stood up to investigate it in person, grabbing my flashlight from the desk. The factory was massive, and the press was located in one of the farthest corners of the building. The narrow hallway that led to it was dark, lit only by the dim light filtering through the high windows. The sound of my footsteps echoed off the walls as I made my way toward it. My flashlight illuminated the floor ahead of me, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and sway unnaturally. As I reached the press, I noticed that it wasn't just stopped, it was as if something had been tampering with it. The controls were out of place. The buttons and levers shifted in a way I knew I hadn't left them. I ran my hand over the cold metal surface, but everything appeared normal at first glance. I turned back to the hallway, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I started to feel it again, the sense that something was watching me. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing. I walked quickly back toward the control room, my mind racing. What was going on? Had someone been in here when I wasn't looking? I checked the time. It was well past midnight. The others were nowhere to be seen. It was just me, alone in this giant, empty building. When I returned to the control room, I found Mia standing in the doorway. She was wide-eyed, looking pale. I hadn't heard her approach. "Hey, did you hear that?" she asked in a low voice, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to be there. I nodded slowly. "Yeah, I heard it too. The shuffling. What's going on?" She hesitated before answering, her voice trembling. "I heard something strange in the hallway, like someone was walking behind me. I turned around, and no one was there. It felt wrong, like someone was standing right behind me. But there was nothing." I stared at her for a long moment, my mind racing. I heard the same thing. And then the machine in the back stopped working. I thought I was just being paranoid, but now I'm not so sure. Mia looked over at the dark hallway, her face tense. "Maybe it's just the building. You know how old it is." I've heard stories about places like this, about how things go wrong when the building settles. I wanted to believe her, to convince myself it was nothing more than the quirks of an old factory. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the noises, it was the way the building seemed to respond to us, to our presence. The press malfunctioning, the strange sounds echoing through the halls, the oppressive silence that seemed to hang in the air. There was something deliberate behind it all, something that was waiting. Theo came in just as I was about to say something more. He wasn't looking at either of us. His eyes were fixed on the floor, his face pale. "You guys hear it too, right?" His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. I thought I was losing it. I've been hearing footsteps, but every time I go check, no one's there. We all stood in silence for a moment, each of us processing the same eerie sensation. None of us had imagined it. It wasn't just one person hearing things, it was all of us. And that, more than anything else, made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. We were silent for a long time, none of us knowing what to say. Finally, Mia broke the silence. "We should stick together. Maybe whatever's going on, it's easier to deal with if we don't feel like we're alone." The three of us agreed to stay together for the rest of the shift, working side by side in the control room, keeping the lights on and the doors locked. We tried to focus on the work, tried to ignore the strange feeling that hung in the air. But the noises didn't stop. The shuffling, the tapping, the feeling that we weren't the only ones there. As the night wore on, I couldn't help but wonder, was the factory really just an old, creaky building? Or was there something more to it, something darker, that had been lying in wait all this time? The unsettling incidents had only just begun, and we were about to learn that the building had a way of making its presence known whether we wanted it to or not. The strange events grew more frequent until they were no longer an anomaly, but an undeniable part of the factory's rhythm. The sounds, the shuffling, the tapping, the low murmurs that echoed down empty hallways started to take on a pattern. It was as if something was learning how to interact with us, how to unsettle us, how to push us to the brink of madness. It was around 2:30 a.m., one night when it happened again. I was at my station, trying to stay focused on the control panel, but my eyes kept darting over to the corner where the old press sat. The shadows seemed thicker there, as though the darkness was congregating around that corner, gathering like a storm. The hairs on my arms stood on end. It wasn't just my imagination. There was something wrong with that place. I glanced over at Mia, who was working at the desk across from me. She had been quieter than usual, her eyes scanning the room nervously, avoiding the press in the far corner. It was clear she was feeling the same tension I was. Suddenly, there was a loud bang. The sound of metal striking metal echoed through the hall, vibrating the floor beneath us. Mia shot up from her chair, eyes wide with shock. "Did you hear that?" she asked, voice shaky. I nodded slowly, already standing up. My heart was pounding in my chest as I grabbed the flashlight from the desk. The hallway was dark, stretching out in front of us like an abyss. Every step I took echoed ominously, the only sound in the otherwise silent factory. The air was thick, heavy with the feeling that we weren't alone. We reached the source of the noise, the press, and what we saw made my stomach drop. The machine was vibrating, its metal parts shaking violently. The controls on the panel flickered, the screen flashing erratically. It was as though someone was trying to operate it from the inside. But we both knew it was impossible. No one could have accessed the machine without triggering the alarms, and the controls were completely locked down. "Is someone messing with us?" Mia whispered, her voice tight with fear. I shook my head, trying to force my racing thoughts to slow down. "No, this doesn't make sense. There's no one else here." We were standing inches away from the machine when it suddenly stopped. Just like that. The vibrations ceased, and the screens went dark. The factory fell silent again, as if nothing had happened. Mia and I exchanged a look. We both knew that whatever was going on, it wasn't just a technical malfunction. There was something alive in this place, something that had taken notice of us. We stepped back, but before we could even begin to process what we had just witnessed, the lights flickered. At first, just a brief flicker, like a power surge. But then, the lights began to blink more rapidly, like a strobe. The whole room was bathed in an eerie, unnatural light, and the air became thick with tension. Maybe we should check the breaker, Mia suggested, though I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. We both hesitated. Neither of us had ever seen the lights do anything like this before. But with the power grid having failed multiple times in the past few weeks, it wasn't entirely out of the question. I nodded, and we moved toward the main control room. As we stepped into the hallway, something caught my eye, a shadow, slipping past one of the doorways up ahead. My blood ran cold. I stopped in my tracks, staring at the empty space. "You saw that, right?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Mia looked at me, wide-eyed, her mouth opening and closing as if she couldn't find the words. "It's not possible." But I had seen it, and I could feel it. Whatever it was, whatever was moving through the factory with us, wasn't a person. We stood in silence for a long moment, listening. The lights flickered again, and in the silence, I swore I could hear a faint hum, a low, almost imperceptible sound that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It was like a drone, a buzz that was too quiet to pinpoint, but too constant to ignore. The feeling of being watched returned, even stronger than before. The walls felt as though they were closing in on us. And then came the whisper of footsteps, barely audible, but unmistakable. They were behind us, moving closer, but when we spun around, the hallway was empty. This time, we didn't wait. We moved quickly toward the breaker room, hoping that a simple reset would restore some sense of normalcy to the factory. But when we reached the door, it was locked, no key in sight. "Who could have locked it?" Mia asked, her voice cracking with anxiety. "We were the only ones in here tonight. No one's been through here." I didn't have an answer. The feeling of dread was suffocating, making it harder to breathe. We had to get out of the hallway, to a place where we could think clearly, but every step seemed to take us deeper into the heart of whatever was happening in this place. We turned to leave, but as we did, I noticed something else. The shadows in the hallway seemed to stretch unnaturally, twisting and undulating like liquid. They reached toward us, as if trying to pull us in. I grabbed Mia's arm, pulling her away from the growing darkness. "We have to get back to the control room," I said, my voice tight with fear. "Now!" We ran. My heart was pounding, and my breathing was shallow, but when we reached the control room, the lights blinked out completely. We were plunged into darkness. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed in the pitch-black room. It was coming from everywhere, surrounding us, filling the space until it was all we could hear. I could feel the air change, thickening with the presence of something else. I reached out, trying to find a flashlight, but my hands were trembling too much. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then it stopped. The silence was deafening. We stood there, waiting for what seemed like an eternity. I could feel Mia beside me, her body tense with fear. "What the hell is happening?" she whispered. Before I could answer, I heard a loud, metallic screech from the far corner of the room. I didn't need to look to know that something enormous was moving toward us. At that moment, I realized the truth. This wasn't just an old factory. This wasn't just a building with a few quirks. Whatever was in here, whatever was making these noises, manipulating the lights, causing the machines to fail, it was alive, and it was aware of us. It was hunting us. "Get the hell out of here," I shouted, shoving Mia toward the door. We bolted out of the room, not daring to look back. The tension in the factory had reached a breaking point. Mia and I were no longer walking, we were running. The fear gnawed at us, urging us forward, even as our minds screamed for us to turn back, to escape this place before it swallowed us whole. But there was nowhere to run. We were trapped. The doors to the main exit were locked, the emergency ladders were jammed, and every attempt to call for help had been met with dead silence. The factory, which once felt like a place of normalcy, had turned into a maze of shadows, echoes, and creeping dread. We had nowhere to go but forward, deeper into the unknown. We reached the control room once again, breathing heavily, our chests tight with the cold, suffocating air. I slammed my hand against the door, desperate to get inside. But when the door creaked open, a sickening realization hit me. The room wasn't empty anymore. The cold, stale air hit me first. The faint smell of oil and rust hung thick in the room, mingling with the pungent odor of something far worse. My heart raced as I stepped into the room, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. At first, it was the silence that unsettled me. The constant hum of the machines, the rhythmic tapping of the lights, it was all gone. The room was still, frozen, as though the entire factory had held its breath. Then I saw it. The figure in the far corner. It was tall, impossibly tall. I couldn't make out any real features at first, just a dark silhouette against the dim light that struggled to filter in. But then it moved. A slow, deliberate motion. Its body seemed to stretch, elongate unnaturally, like something out of a nightmare. My vision blurred, the edges of the figure twisting as though reality itself was bending to accommodate it. I heard Mia gasp, and I turned to find her rooted to the spot, her face pale, eyes wide in terror. She wasn't breathing. She couldn't. I tried to speak, but my throat felt thick, like I had swallowed something sharp. I couldn't find my words. I couldn't even move. All I could do was stare at the figure, frozen in place like an animal caught in the gaze of a predator. The thing in the corner twitched again, its limbs stretching further, cracking like dry branches. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were dark holes, pools of inky blackness that seemed to absorb the very light around them. It stared at us, not with malice, but with cold, detached curiosity. It was studying us, sizing us up. My mind raced, trying to comprehend what I was seeing, but the more I thought about it, the more I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. But then, it spoke. The voice came from everywhere at once inside my head, in my ears, reverberating in the very walls of the room. It wasn't a voice I could describe in any way I understood. It was a low, guttural sound, like something ancient, primal, reaching into the depths of my mind. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice whispered, each word like a jagged knife in my skull. I staggered back, trying to retreat, but my legs refused to move. I was paralyzed with fear, trapped in the grip of something I couldn't even begin to understand. The thing in the corner shifted again, and the air grew thick with a heavy pressure, as if the entire room was closing in on us. "We are always watching," the voice continued, each word wrapping around me, squeezing tighter and tighter. "You cannot leave. Not now." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was watch as the figure in the corner seemed to grow larger, its form expanding as though it were pulling itself from the very walls, from the darkness that had saturated this place. It was everywhere now, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. The room seemed to distort, the walls bending inward, and I could hear a faint, distant scream, a sound I couldn't place. Was it me? Was it Mia? Or was it something else, something trapped in this nightmare with us? I reached out for Mia, but she was no longer standing beside me. I spun around, panic clawing at my chest, and found her on the floor, her eyes wide in terror, her body rigid, as though she were caught in some sort of trance. "Mia!" I screamed, but she didn't respond. She was frozen, her pupils dilated in fear, her chest barely rising with shallow breaths. I reached out, shaking her, but it was like touching stone. Her skin was cold, unyielding, and I realized with a sickening jolt that she wasn't breathing at all. She was gone. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I was alone. Before I could process what had just happened, the figure in the corner lurched forward, its body stretching impossibly long, its limbs distorting and twisting. It was no longer a shape. It was a force, a presence, a living nightmare that seemed to take up the entire room. My heart slammed in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I tried to move, tried to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead, weighed down by an invisible force. I was frozen, unable to escape. The thing reached out, its fingers, if they could even be called that, sliding across the floor toward me. They were long, thin, and twisted, ending in sharp claw-like tips that scraped against the ground with a sound that echoed in my skull. "You should never have come here," it repeated, its voice filling the entire room, suffocating me. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. The figure froze in place, its limbs halting mid-motion. The room, which had been suffocating just moments ago, became eerily still. The silence was deafening. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was watch, my eyes locked on the thing that had haunted my every step. And then, just as I thought it was over, the walls cracked open with a thunderous roar, and the factory was swallowed by darkness. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the sound of my own scream, mingling with the sound of something far worse, something that wasn't human. And then, nothing. When I awoke, it wasn't to the comforting hum of the factory machines or the endless clanking of metal on metal. Instead, there was a silence so deep, so absolute, that it felt like the world had been swallowed whole. I wasn't sure how long I'd been unconscious. Minutes? Hours? Days? Time had lost all meaning in that place. And now, it felt as though I was suspended in a dream-like void. I opened my eyes, only to be greeted by the cold, sterile light of the factory's overhead lamps. My body ached, as though I had been dragged across a harsh, unforgiving surface. My head was pounding, a deep throb that seemed to pulse with every beat of my heart. I tried to sit up, but my limbs felt weak, uncoordinated, like I hadn't used them in days. It took several attempts to pull myself together, but eventually I managed to steady myself. I looked around, the walls of the factory still looming large and silent. But something was different. The oppressive darkness, the presence that had loomed over us, seemed to have faded. It wasn't gone, but it was no longer as immediate, as palpable as it had been. For a moment, I thought it was over. Maybe, just maybe, we had survived. But then I remembered Mia. "Mia!" I shouted, panic surging through me like an electric current. "Mia, where are you?" There was no response, no movement. I scrambled to my feet, the dizziness momentarily overcoming me as I staggered across the room. The control room was now empty. The machines, which had once hummed with life, were now still, their glowing screens dark and lifeless. I called out for Mia again, but the silence swallowed my voice. A knot tightened in my stomach. My heart raced, each beat a sharp reminder of how fragile my situation was. She couldn't be gone. She couldn't have been taken from me like this. I stumbled through the factory, my footsteps echoing off the cold metal floors. I had no idea where I was going, only that I had to find her. The place was enormous, too vast for me to search blindly, but I had no choice. Every room I passed was abandoned, every corner empty. It was as if the factory had been erased, leaving only its skeleton behind. As I passed through the main hall, I stopped in front of the security desk. The monitors were dark, but something caught my eye. A small piece of paper. It was crumpled, discarded like it had been left in a hurry, and it glinted under the harsh fluorescent lights. I picked it up, and my fingers trembled as I unfolded it. The message was short, simple. "Get out." The words were written in shaky, almost illegible handwriting, and they sent a chill down my spine. The air felt thick with tension, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. But there was no sign of anyone, no workers, no management, no Mia. I tried to steady my breathing, but my mind was racing. What had happened? What had we unleashed in this place? And where was Mia? I turned to leave the room, but something caught my attention. A low hum, a faint, almost imperceptible sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It wasn't the normal hum of the machines. It was something different, something wrong. Without thinking, I followed the sound. The closer I got, the more the noise seemed to intensify, vibrating through my body, shaking my bones. I rounded a corner and entered a small storage room, one I had never noticed before. And then I saw it. Mia! She was standing in the center of the room, motionless, her back to me. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and her limbs were stiff, like she was a puppet whose strings had been pulled too tight. She wasn't breathing. Her skin had a pale, almost ashen quality to it, and her eyes were wide, unblinking, staring at nothing. I rushed forward, my breath catching in my throat, but as I approached, a strange, invisible force seemed to push me back. It was like a wall of air, cold and oppressive, that wouldn't let me get any closer. Mia! I screamed, reaching out, desperate to make contact. But she didn't move. Her eyes remained locked in a terrifying gaze, as though she were staring at something beyond the fabric of reality itself. And then, slowly, her mouth opened. It wasn't her voice. It couldn't be. The words that spilled out of her lips were inhuman, guttural sounds that twisted the very air around us. The language, if you could even call it that, was ancient, like something from a time before humans had even walked the earth. The words seemed to pulse with a dark energy, each one vibrating with an unnatural force that rattled the walls. I fell back, my heart hammering in my chest, as the room around us began to warp. The walls began to stretch and twist, distorting as if the fabric of reality itself was tearing apart. And as the factory seemed to fold in on itself, I realized with a sickening jolt that I wasn't going to escape. I wasn't going to leave. I had been wrong. Mia hadn't been taken. She hadn't left me. She was still here, but she wasn't Mia anymore. Whatever had infected this place, whatever had begun to warp the reality we had once known, had claimed her. It had taken her body and twisted it into something else, something unrecognizable. I backed away, my hands shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I realized the horrifying truth. We hadn't just disturbed something in the factory. We had unleashed it, and now it was feeding on us. I turned and ran. The factory had turned into a nightmare, a place where time and space no longer held meaning, where the very air seemed to cling to me, suffocating me with each breath. I ran through the hallways, through the rooms, my mind blank, my only thought being escape, escape, escape. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how many doors I tried to break through, they all led me back to the same place, the same room where Mia stood, her mouth still moving with that terrifying language, her eyes still locked in that empty stare. And then, in the corner of the room, I saw it. The thing that had been watching me all this time. The thing that had been pulling the strings. It wasn't a figure anymore. It was a presence, a force that radiated from every corner of the factory, from every crack in the walls. It was in the air, in the shadows, in the very ground beneath my feet. I couldn't fight it. There was no way to win. But I had to try. I made one last, desperate push toward the exit. My legs were weak, my chest tight, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let it claim me too. Not like Mia. And then, I was outside. The air was fresh, crisp, and for a moment, I thought I had made it. I had escaped. But as I turned to look back at the factory, I saw it something that sent a shiver down my spine. I never returned to that factory, and I don't think I ever will. Even as I sit here now, the memories of that night still haunt me. The images of Mia and the dark presence that filled that place etched in my mind like scars. I can still hear the hum, the terrible sound that grew louder with every step I took toward the heart of the factory. That low vibration still seems to echo in my bones, reminding me of what we disturbed and what we couldn't escape. I told myself I'd move on. I tried to forget, to convince myself that it was all just a bad dream, an episode of my mind spinning out of control from the exhaustion of working the night shifts for so long. But every time I close my eyes, I see her face. Mia. I see the way her eyes stared into nothing, her lips forming words that weren't hers, that couldn't have been hers. In the months that followed, I kept hearing rumors about the factory. People said it had shut down, that the doors were sealed shut, never to open again. But I knew better. I knew that what had been unleashed inside those walls wasn't something that could be contained with a simple lock and key. That presence, whatever it was still there. It was still feeding, still waiting for the next poor soul to wander into its grasp. I couldn't let go of the guilt. Mia had been my responsibility. I had been the one who convinced her to stay, who told her we could handle whatever was happening, that we could figure it out together. But I couldn't protect her. I couldn't save her. And now, I'll never know if she's still in there, trapped in that place, lost to whatever dark force had claimed her. The nightmares didn't stop. They never did. Every time I thought I was free of it, every time I thought I could breathe easy, the memories came rushing back of the empty hallways, of the strange language echoing through the air, of the distorted factory, of Mia's lifeless eyes staring at me, unblinking. I moved away from the town soon after. I found another job, far from the factory, far from everything that reminded me of that night. But the fear, the uncertainty, it's always with me. It follows me like a shadow, a constant reminder that whatever happens in the dark, whatever forces we disturb in the pursuit of progress, are not easily forgotten. They linger, and they always come back. I can't forget the feeling of being watched. Even now, as I sit in this room, in the quiet of the night, I feel it. That cold, oppressive presence. It's always just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting, watching. Maybe the factory is truly gone, but I know the thing inside it is still out there. Maybe it's waiting for someone else to make the mistake we did walking in, not knowing that some things should never be disturbed, some things should never be investigated. In the end, we were all just pawns in a game we didn't understand. Maybe it was a game of survival. Maybe it was something far darker. All I know is that the factory wasn't just a building. It was a portal, a doorway to something we could never comprehend. And Mia? I still hear her sometimes, in the dark, in my dreams. Her voice isn't the same anymore. It's hollow, distant, and it calls to me. I don't know what happened to Mia. I don't know what happened to the others. And I don't know what's still out there, waiting, lurking in the places we can't see. But I do know this: once you step inside a place like that, once you open that door, there's no turning back. Some things, once disturbed, cannot be put back into the darkness. And so, I live with it. The uncertainty, the fear, the memories. I live with the knowledge that whatever I encountered that night, whatever we uncovered, is still out there, waiting. Maybe someday, someone will uncover the truth. Maybe they'll learn what happened in that factory, what we let loose. But for now, it's just me and the haunting thought that we were never meant to know. So, I leave you with this. The factory wasn't just a place. It was a warning to those who would seek out the unknown, to those who would reach too far, dig too deep. Some things are better left untouched, for in the end, curiosity does not always lead to answers. Sometimes it leads to something far worse. If you find yourself standing in the dark, facing the unknown, I beg you turn away. Because some things should never be uncovered. Some doors should never be opened. And if you do find yourself in a place like that, be warned, it might already be too late.